Call to order this regularly scheduled meeting of the Community Development Committee of the Metropolitan Council for Monday, May 6, 2019, and joined by a quorum of the committee. Council members, we have an agenda before us, and I would ask for a motion to approve.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? That carries. We were provided with the minutes of the regularly scheduled meeting of April 15th, 2019, and I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
And is there
Second.
a second? Okay. Any discussion, additions, corrections? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? And that carries. We will move on to our business items on the agenda. Business item number 1 is 2019-98. It's Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund Grant for Phelan Regional Park in St. Paul. And Ms. Jensen will present. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, committee members. My name is Deb Jensen, and I am the Parks Finance Planner for our Regional Parks Unit. Because this is the first Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund grant request that we've brought before you as a new council, I thought I'd take just a very few minutes to explain the grant program so you understand it a little better and you know what you're voting on.
Thanks, Ms. Jensen.
We typically call this the PAOF account because we're so fond of acronyms. The council has been giving grants to assist the regional parks implementing agencies with buying property for the regional park system for nearly 40 years. In 2008, the taxpayers passed the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, which we typically just call the Legacy Amendment. And in 2009, the legislature passed the Park and Trails Fund statute that requires a Park Acquisition Opportunity Fund grant program. And it funds it with 10% of our annual appropriation from Legacy, which is in the last few years, it's been between 18 million and 20 million a year for our overall appropriation. And we get 10% of that for our Acquisition Opportunity Fund. In addition to that, we have another funding source that is from the Environment and Natural Resource Trust Fund. And we look at the two of those different funds and we apply the one that fits to the individual property acquisitions because the requirements are different. The one that I'll be bringing you tonight is on, it's a legacy grant. And then whichever funding source we use, the council matches every $3 in state funds with $2 in council bonds. Our Park Acquisition Opportunity Funds, like all our park grants, can only be awarded to the 10 regional parks implementing agencies that actually own and operate our world-class park system. The properties are reviewed, the applications are reviewed for eligibility, which includes that the property is within the boundaries of a council-approved master plan. If we get an acquisition request for one of our older park units that may not have an updated master plan, you will typically see a master plan item come through, and immediately following, you'll see the acquisition request come through. But we can't put the cart before the horse here. Once the master plan boundaries are established, we know what the in-holdings are, what the properties that the park agency still needs to acquire, we know what those are. And if a property comes in that is not within the boundary of the master plan, we have a current master plan, we may need to amend that master plan to change the shape of the boundary and bring the additional property in. Tonight's is within the boundary of the regional park. And I think the last thing I need to tell you is that this grant program is done on a first come, first serve basis. That's set in the Regional Parks Policy Plan that was approved last November, and it's been that way since the beginning of the program. The reason for that is the park agencies diligently try to avoid the use of eminent domain. So they are working with willing sellers, and because of the unpredictability of when property will become available, there isn't a mechanism to do geographic distribution or to look at equity issues in this because it really doesn't apply to the acquisition of property. So you will see these and you will hear them as being whether they're in line or not. So we put them in line when we know that they are eligible and that they are within a master plan and they're complete. We look at the appraisal, we look at the title searches, we review the purchase agreement to make sure it matches the appraisal. So we do a fairly thorough review before we bring it to the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, who looked at this item last Thursday. So I appreciate you hearing this one today.
Thank you. Thanks for that overview, Ms. Jensen. Any questions on the overview? I had a question, if I may. The $3 to $2 match with the state funds, is that statutory or is that Met Council policy?
Mr. Chair, no, it is Metropolitan Council policy.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
I beg your pardon. For legacy, it is in statute 85.53, but for funds from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, it is not in statute, but we have chosen to match at the same level.
Okay, thank you.
So the item before you tonight is for the benefit of the Phelan Keller Regional Park. And you can see its general location in the metro in the blue circle. It is north of St. Paul. More specifically, this property is along the eastern side of Lake Phelan. You can see the red circle with a dot below it. That is where the property is. This parcel is really interesting. It's quite different than some of the ones we normally see because of its shape. It's 50 feet wide and 773 feet long. So it's a very long, narrow triangle. What is really useful about it for the city of St. Paul is that it is bounded on the east side, where that dashed blue line is, by the Bruce Bento Regional Trail. It's bounded on the west side by Lake Phelan, so it sits right in between them. And the city is going to use this parcel to build the only set of restrooms on the east side of Phelan Keller Regional Park. It will also serve as a trailhead and restroom and water source for the folks on the Bruce Bento Regional Trail. Property does have a house, and that's important because it has a bearing on which funding source we choose. Our funding from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund cannot be used for properties that have a habitable residence on them. So that immediately shifts this one over to our legacy funding. The house was built in the 60s. It has some significant deferred maintenance issues, water damage, mold, that sort of thing. As a part of our review process, we always look at whether it's feasible to move the house to see if it can be reused somehow. We ask that question in the application. With this one, because of its age, they suspect that it may have asbestos inside of it, and it also has so much deferred maintenance in it that they don't think it's reasonable to move this one. The top picture here is the view of the lake from the house. And the other one is the view of the house from the lake. At the request of Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen, we are adding an element to this kind of business item that specifically addresses the connections that are in place for the property. This property is served by 3 Metro Transit routes, and it is also, as I said, along the Bruce Bento Regional Trail. In each case, you will see us go through the rationale for recommendations as you do any other business item. Here, this is in conformance with the 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan. It is also in conformance with its master plan, and it is within the annual limit that the council has set by policy to ensure that no one agency uses up all of the acquisition funding. So it's first come, first served, but only up to $1.7 million per funding source, either the Natural Resources Trust Fund or or legacy for grants in the state fiscal year time period. So any grant awarded between July 1st of one year and June 30th of the other year, the next year, we tally up what each agency gets within that time period, and we limit that to 1.7 billion. This is St. Paul's second grant within the current state fiscal year. They're well within their cap. You'll notice that there is also a recommendation here for future reimbursement consideration. That is an unusual concept that you might not have seen elsewhere. The council has a couple of limited sets of situations in which the council will consider reimbursing an agency for dollars it spends up front from a future bonding cycle. So in this case, St. Paul has asked for their local match to be reimbursed at a later date. And I'll show you what the amounts are in a moment. The purchase price on this property was $240,000. We watch that we don't pay for anything more than 110% of the appraised value. We just had one where we had to cap it at 110%, and the agency was responsible for the costs over that amount. So we watched that carefully. We also watch to make sure that the appraisal is within the last 12 months so that it isn't stale. The other costs that contributed to this project were the cost of the appraisal, the holding and closing costs, which in this case were mostly taxes, and the stewardship category is sometimes for things like pulling out a driveway so that we stop the public from accessing the property until the implementing agency intends for it to be open to the public. In this case, that is mostly demolition and asphalt removal to take that house out. But what they're going to do is cap the water, and they'll use that for the restrooms that they're planning on building. So of that amount, the state will contribute from two separate state fiscal years. We had a small amount remaining from our fiscal year 2018 legacy money. The balance of it will come out of the 2019 legacy money. The council match on there, I beg your pardon, I can't read it very well. Uh-oh, sorry. The council match is $86,828, and the total grant would be $217.65. And the reason that you see dollars and cents on here for such large amounts of money is that we calculate this on a percentage basis. The state winds up paying 45% of the grant amount. The council pays 30%, and the agency pays 25%. So when we do those calculations, we do them right out to the penny, and that's how we make sure everybody stays honest. The agency match here is $72,355. So the agency has requested that the council approve only considering to reimburse that at a later date. It doesn't promise that they will get it. Therefore, the proposed action is these four items, and I want to explain to you the breakdown. The first one will always be the amount of the grant. In this case, $217,065.20 to the City of St. Paul to acquire the 0.89 acre McKinney parcel located at 1298 Arlington Avenue East in the City of St. Paul. The second one is always to authorize our Community Development Director to execute the grant and the restrictive covenant on behalf of the council. This is so we don't have to bother the chair or the regional administrator for signatures. The third and fourth bullets on here refer to the future reimbursement consideration. So consider reimbursing the City of St. Paul for up to $72,355.21 from its share of a future Regional Parks capital bonding program. If they choose to request that money in a future bonding cycle, it will neither diminish nor increase their share. If they had a share that year of $1 million, which is highly unlikely, they have $1 million, then that would come out of their $1 million. The fourth one is a caveat that we always include in these items. Inform the city that the council does not under any circumstances represent or guarantee that the council will grant future reimbursement, and that expenditure of local funds never entitles a park agency to reimbursement. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Jensen. Questions on that report? Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Chair. I just sort of a question of curiosity when you talk about which funds could be accessed for this, and you talk about not being able to use the Environmental Trust Fund funds because it's not habitable, and yet you talk about asbestos, mold, water damage, etc. What's the definition of habitable in its current state? Ever with rehab? What is the definition?
Ms. Jensen.
Mr. Chair, committee member, the city makes that determination. So in each case, the city where the property is located makes the determination. We had one 2 years ago in Maple Grove that the house had just like completely collapsed on the inside. So we had a condemnation notice from the city that we included, and we were able then to access the Natural Resource Trust Fund dollars.
Thank you. Further questions? Councilmember Mento.
Mr. Chair, hi. I'm wondering about the asbestos removal. Is that included in the anticipated costs?
Ms. Jensen.
Mr. Chair, committee member, it would be yes.
Okay.
These amounts cap our liability.
Okay.
Further questions? Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. I just would like to say thank you for including that connection to transit. It just is really helpful, and trails to understand, especially in areas that maybe we're not all familiar with, what are the opportunities when we see them. So I wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Councilmember Lee, then Councilmember Lindstrom.
Oh, thank you. So if we can't promise them 72,000, but we say that we might give it to them in the future, in the past, have we not given them the money that we said we might? And then what do cities do?
Ms. Jensen.
Mr. Chair, committee member, when we do bonding rounds, we also apply that $3 in state money to $2 in council bonds. Unfortunately, we can't pay these reimbursement costs out of state bonds. They can only come out of council bonds. So when we get the requests in, we have to balance how many reimbursement requests there are. I don't know of an instance where we have not been able to fund the requested reimbursements. And if we couldn't fund it, it would merely be deferred until a future bonding round. What would happen if, for example, if we had a $15 million bonding round and the council's match was $10 million, if we had more than $10 million in reimbursements, we would ask the agencies to look at their projects again and get that number down to below 10 million.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you. I'm just curious, a two-part question, if that's okay. Who does the appraisals? And sorry if you mentioned this, but has the seller agreed to the sale yet or not?
Ms. Jensen.
Mr. Chair, committee member, we will only accept an application with an accompanying copy of a signed purchase agreement. And I beg your pardon, I just lost your first question.
Councilmember.
Mr. Chair, the appraisal, how does that all come about? Who does that?
Ms. Jensen.
Mr. Chair, the appraisal is done by the implementing agency. If it is less than $1 million, we only need that appraisal. If it's more than $1 million, we can, at our discretion, require either a second appraisal or an appraisal review. We will be bringing you an application request in either June or July, in which the council performed a second appraisal in-house through our real estate unit.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to follow up on Councilmember Lee's question. The reimbursement portion comes out of a formula with that bonding money and the state and our match. And so each agency has a piece of that pie, so they know ahead of time what their piece of the pie is going to be. This reimbursement would not change the size of their pie, so they're not competing with anybody else. But a lot of times agencies are doing work way ahead of when we have money for things that they are eligible for reimbursement for. So they have the option of making a list for later. So in a future year, They can ask for reimbursement for projects they've already done or land they've already acquired, or they can make it for new projects that they're going to do once they get the money. It's at the agency's discretion. Some of the agencies could have $10 million in backlog. Some agencies don't have any backlog. It varies from agency to agency, but it's just to protect us, to let them know. Some future council might decide, you know what, we don't want to pay any of that backlog. It's not going to happen. So we can't obligate a future council to pay. So it's just sort of a legalese to let them know that just because we're willing to do that in the future doesn't mean that another council might have that same feeling.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may,
Ms. Jensen.
to follow up, next meeting, you will have another request for future reimbursement consideration. And it's my intention to explain that in more detail when we do that business item.
Thank you. Further questions for Ms. Jensen? Seeing none, I will entertain a motion on the four-part proposed action.
Motion to approve.
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Thank you. And discussion on that motion. Discussion. Councilmember Bento.
Mr. Chair, as someone who used to live near this area and used the trail a lot, usually by that point on the trail, not the Vento Trail, but the path around the lake itself, and usually by that point in the pedaling or walking, well, the pedaling, I'd be far behind Bruce, but that location for this purpose is just perfect. This is a good-sized lake. Most people don't think of St. Paul as the lake side of the Twin Cities. It's a good-sized lake, and unless your body's in sync and you need to use the bathroom when you're on the west side of the lake, you're going to be in trouble by the time you get to the east side. So this is perfect. It's a great move.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was looking at the Apple map of this to get sort of a broader than the picture view, and it already shows it as being parkland. If you switch between satellite
Oh,
and
interesting.
the map view, it already shows it as being part of the park.
Google is anticipating our action today. Great. Thank you. Further discussion on the motion? Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
I apologize. I could have maybe asked this earlier. I'm just curious. It's so wonderful when we're able to do things like this. Do we do any kind of communications to the public or citizens, whether if they're gifting or a follow-up just to say thank you for that? And maybe it's inappropriate, but I'm curious how we help to educate our citizenry about the opportunities to do things like this and recognize them when they do.
Ms. Brajas, do you want to answer?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen, I certainly for some large donations, Coney Island and Lake Waconia was a big press release that the council had put out in partnership with parks implementing agencies. When we have a series of multiple grants, usually coming out of bonding, we will also do press releases as part of that as well, especially highlighting where there are partnerships maybe that are unique or different than how we normally would operate. Generally, the agencies take the lead on a lot of that work as well, since they are doing that work on the ground and leading that. But certainly we like to highlight where we are adding regional funds to the conversation.
Thank you. Further discussion on that motion? Further discussion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
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 Opposed? That carries. Thank you for your report
Thank
and
you,
for your
Mr.
work
Chair.
on this, Ms. Jensen. Our next item is another comprehensive plan review. That's item number 2019-105. It's a joint report with the Environment Committee as well. And I would invite Mr. Riley.
Hi, committee members, Chair. I just wanted to take a minute and introduce
Please.
Jake Riley.
Thank you.
I'm Angela Torres, the Manager of Local Planning Assistance. I've been before you a couple of times, but as we go through a couple of the comprehensive plan updates, what you'll see is many of the sector representatives representing plans from their communities. And I wanted to take a second and introduce Jake today. He's been with the council for about a year and a half. He came to us from the city of St. Paul, where he had worked there for about 10 years, and he serves District 3, most of District 3 today. So, okay.
Thank you, Ms. Torres. Mr. Riley, welcome.
Thank you, Chair Lilligren. Thank you, Angela. Um, good afternoon. We're here today to talk about the review of the City of Orono 2040 Comprehensive Plan. Community Development Director Jeremy Barnhart and other city staff are here to answer questions that if I am not able to. And we'll start with the regional systems map. You may be familiar with the City of Orono. It's located on Lake Minnetonka in Hennepin County. It's surrounded by Medina, Plymouth, Wayzata, Minnetonka Beach, Minnetrista, Mound, Spring Park, and Tonka Bay. And the City of Long Lake is entirely within the City of Orono. The map shows the regional systems for the community, and of note are US Highway 12, which traverses the northern third of the city, the Loose Line State Trail, which bisects the community east to west. That's the big green line there. The Dakota Rail Regional Trail also travels through the community, and there are a couple of search corridors for the area to finish some of those connections. And then the regional wastewater system is also depicted here. The City of Orono has two community designations. One is rural residential, the other is emerging suburban edge. The lighter shade of green in the picture is the emerging suburban edge. It's the rural residential section of the city. It's generally applied to the sort of northern half of things. And the remainder of the city falls in the rural residential category. The remainder of the city falls in the emerging suburban edge community. That's where most of the development in Orono is, including the commercial district. Sorry, I'm a little rusty. I haven't been before the committee in a while, so I appreciate your patience with me. Today I have for you Table 1 from the staff report, which features the forecasted growth for the City of Orono. The council forecasts are the same in the plan as we have today. There's no changes, as you may have seen with some other communities. And it shows that between 2020 and 2040, the city will grow by approximately 1,400 people, representing 700 households, and there's an anticipated increase of about 100 jobs in the city in the same time frame. The city's planned residential densities meet the emergent suburban edge areas of the city. That's what we show here. That's where much of the development is expected in the city. The overall density for guided residential land is expected between 4.18 and 8.10 units per acre between now and 2040. Communities with a rural residential designation under the Thrive 2040 plan are expected to plan for forecasted population and household growth at average densities of not more than 1 unit per 10 acres. Those with an emerging suburban edge designation need to accommodate growth with an overall average minimum density of 3 to 5 units per acre, which their plan meets. They plan for a minimum density of 4.18 units per acre, and they'll maintain a maximum density of 1 unit per 2 acres in the rest of the city. It follows the typical development pattern of the communities around the lake. Future land use map is taken directly from their comprehensive plan. They're expected to remain stable through 2040. Increases in density will take place on existing properties through subdivision or redevelopment, and the city anticipates that most of those properties are available for redevelopment at any time, so there's no staged depiction of growth in this particular plan. So we have proposed findings for you to forward to the council today. One, that the plan conforms to the Metropolitan System's plans, that it is consistent with council policies and with proposed amendments to the suburban. Is consistent with council policies with proposed amendments to the suburban community designation, and is compatible with the plans of adjacent local jurisdiction, governmental units, and affected jurisdictions. And then let me see if it's not quite right. And so your proposed action today is to authorize the City of Orono to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect, and advise the city that if changes are made, these are typical advisory comments that we have for them, that if changes are made to the city's water supply plan resulting from the Department of Natural Resources review of the plan, they have not yet finalized that review. The city will need to provide the council and DNR with the updated information. To provide the date the city adopts the local water management plan when that plan is approved, and they'll include that document when they submit it. But they will include that document with their final submission to the Metropolitan Council. And then there's some discrepancy between the DNR submittal and our submittal, so we'd like them to rectify that. And then consider the advisory comments in the review record for transportation, forecasts, and housing, and those comments are in your staff report. The Environment Committee will also take action on this comprehensive plan. That is expected to be Tuesday the 14th. And the proposed action is for the Environment Committee to approve the City of Orono's comprehensive sewer plan of the city's 2040 comprehensive plan. And I think that covers everything that I am here to cover.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Any questions on that report? Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, thank you. I had never known that Long Lake was within Orono. Sounds like the Vatican. So how does that work when the one city is within another city? Like is there a political situation there? Do they work together, or do we approve their plans closely? Or
Mr. Riley.
Chair Lilligan, perhaps we'll defer to Director Barajas.
Ms. Barajas.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Lee, as with all local governments, they, as part of the local planning process, they're required to coordinate with all of their adjacent and affected jurisdictions. And no doubt that there is increased coordination. And as you can see on one of the maps, if you zoom in a bit, especially in that northern piece, there is some planned redevelopment around Wayzata Boulevard going east-west there, as well as shared with the city of Long Lake. Certainly, we do have representatives in the audience who might speak more detailed from the city of Orono, who might speak in more detail to the relationship with the city of Long Lake, if you would like.
oh, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Chambliss.
Yes, regarding the discrepancy on the water supply, how much time do they have to update that information? Is that the May 14th date or?
Mr. Riley.
Chair Lilligren, thank you, committee member. I believe they can update it anytime between when we authorize them to put their plan into place and when they submit their final documentation to us.
Okay.
So there's, it's not time sensitive in terms of the Environment Committee.
Okay.
Thank you. Further questions on that report? Councilmember Vento, you look like you're going to ask a question.
Mr. Chair, I'm just curious, how many other Long Lake type in-holdings do we have? Are there many others?
Ms. Barajas.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento, there are several around the region. I can count at least half a dozen off the top of my head. Most of them are very small in character. Maple Plain, Medicine Lake in Plymouth, Landfall in the city of Oakdale.
Sure.
So pretty small, represent small areas, whether they were, in many cases, were existing communities where the township incorporated around them.
Okay.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We also have one township that is city-like but has not been able to become a city because you have to be contiguous, and they're spotty with it's White Bear Lake Township. They're very much a city, but they can never be anything but a township unless they want to give up part of their territory.
Interesting. Councilmember Vento.
It's in my district, Mr. Chair, it's in my district, and they tried to explain it to me, and I got so kind of nauseous almost, because it was like, whoa.
Thank you. Further questions for Mr. Riley on that report? Further questions? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to authorize the City of Orono to place its 2040 comprehensive plan into effect, and then with advice to the city. Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Thank you. A second?
Second.
Thank you. Discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. Thank you, Mr. Riley.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Councilmember Vento.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to note, I had a meeting recently with a mayor and a city manager, and toward the end of the meeting, the city manager commented on the 2040 plan, and she said it's a lot of work, but she went on at length to talk about the benefits that doing the city plan has for the city.
Right.
She said, we take time, we are forced to pause and take time to think about the future when we be too caught up with the present to really do that kind of planning. So it was, as a new member of the council, it was really pretty cool to hear that kind of a comment coming from someone whose life is pretty wrapped around the 2040 plan.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing, Councilmember. Thank you. We'll move on to the information items. The first is the 2020 Community Development Preliminary Budget Discussion with the Director, Ms. Barajas. And also being joined by Ms. Augustin Hubner. Is that it?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, council members. On your agenda tonight, we have our division, Community Development Division budget overview, not for action tonight, but information item to set you up for future action. And then we're going to segue into the HRA budget detailed information with Terry Smith, our Metro HRA Director. So we'll do a little bit of musical chairs. We'll pause in between for questions and then transition to her as well.
Thank you.
So just a reminder, I believe I've shown you this slide before, but Community Development Division has kind of 7 primary responsibilities, major responsibilities that we cover. One is providing that coordinated regional planning and policy that guides the growth and development of the region. So when Thrive MSP 2040 leading the development of that. We partner with our regional parks implementing agencies to plan for and also fund the regional park system, providing technical assistance to local governments to implement their regional policy in their local planning efforts. We facilitate community collaboration around the region of issues of shared and regional importance. We deliver state and federally funded rent assistance to create and provide affordable housing for low-income households. And then we provide our Livable Communities Act grants to help clean up polluted sites, expand housing choices, and build developments that connect housing, jobs, and services. And finally, which you heard about in our committee of the whole last week, we perform a plethora of research that informs regional decision-making and the overall conversation of the region around issues of importance. So for today, we'll talk about the 2019 and give you an overview of our existing budget for this calendar year, and then a preview of our 2020 budget development process. We'll also start targeted budget conversations around the HRA budget and the Parks Equity Grant Program, which is next on your information item list. As we move forward with the 2020 budget, we want to make sure that you have enough background to make informed decisions and have the opportunity to actively discuss and weigh in on policy level issues. So I have Heather with me here today because she is our finance director and she can really help answer the more detailed nitty-gritty number stuff, and I am more at the policy level on things. So just to walk through that, 2019 budget, our objectives were very straightforward. Our budget is designed to support Thrive MSP 2040, to implement the housing and regional parks policy plans, and to continue work on our core programs that support the residents and communities in the metro area. An emphasis on any budget is, of course, on financial stewardship, and our intention is to construct a balanced budget, identify structural issues where they exist, and mitigate those over time, and maintain reserve balances at the council policy levels. So we'll walk through 3 major components of the community development budget today. This includes our operations, our pass-through, and our capital programs. Looking at community development operations as a whole, which is what you see on this slide, total revenues and expenses come in at about $18 million. Nearly half of our operations budget funds operations of the HRA. The remaining half funds division management and our regional allocations and our work units, including parks, livable communities, research, and local planning assistance. We use about 80% of our budget for staff and regional allocation support needed to operate our programs. The remaining 20% of the budget is used for contracted services and other costs. So property taxes and federal dollars pay for 84% of our operations, and that's what you see on the chart on the far right. Other smaller sources include revenue from our council-owned housing, which is represented by that smaller slice that has the FAHP on it. That means our Family Affordable Housing Program. Over 80% of the community development operating budget is comprised of pass-through dollars for housing assistance, for regional parks implementing agencies, and for livable community grantees. The pass-through program is funded by federal, state, and local dollars, and I'll talk more about these programs in future slides. The Parks Capital Program is $375 million and is funded primarily with state funds. The council provides a regional match, as Deb was mentioning earlier in her presentation, and our contribution represents about 17% of the program revenue. The council does not match direct appropriations, commonly referred to as earmarks, and we do not use any of the capital dollars ourselves. So in any given legislative year, during a session, the legislature may target a certain amount of bonding to specific programs or specific projects that in some years, or in this year and last year, that had included funding for the White Bear Lake Links Trail, I believe it is. Part of it is regional, but a whole portion of that was directed to the cities around there to help construct and build that trail. So we act as a fiscal agent for those and do not add additional regional dollars to those pots. So those funds are used to preserve, improve, and expand the regional park system. And then you have seen this slide in the past, but I wanted to refer you to it again, just as a reminder that on this graphic, all four of our grant programs are sourced through state funds, several of which are distributed by formula and statute, as Deb had mentioned. You can also see that the council provides a regional bonds match in 3 out of 4 of our grant programs. We currently have 150 active grants valued at about $120 million and anticipate awarding about $185 million in the next 6 years. Similarly, for our Livable Communities grant programs, as you may recall from when Paul Burns presented a Livable Communities overview, we have 4 programs there as well. These are commonly referred to as LCA because we love our acronyms. And they provide funding for communities to invest in local economic revitalization, workforce housing initiatives, and development or redevelopment that connects different land uses and transportations. As a reminder, this program is voluntary. It's an incentive-based approach to help communities grow and redevelop and to address the region's affordable and life cycle housing needs. We can go more into detail in each of the programs if you wish, but I know that Paul has talked to you about these in the past as well. And then as a reminder that while it's voluntary, communities do have a responsibility to actually be eligible for the program and enroll in the program. They must negotiate long-term affordable and life cycle housing goals with the council and develop a housing action plan to accomplish these goals. In 2019, we have 96 participating communities that are eligible to compete for funding from all 4 LCA categories. We currently have over 200 active grants valued at about $102 million and anticipate awarding about $20 million this year. So as a preview to our HRA discussion coming up, as you have heard, I think when Mary Bogie presented to you on your council Budget 101 presentation early on in your tenure, our HRA budget has a structural deficit. So Terry's going to provide more detail later in this presentation. But I wanted to just give you a high-level introduction of the issues that we're facing. The HRA budget in particular is feeling the impacts of housing market trends in our region. With rising rents and very low vacancy rates, this puts upward pressure on rents and difficulty in making sure we're meeting those and funding those rents in a way that meets the objectives that the council has outlined. We have been working on the structural deficit for a couple of years now, and in our 2017 and 2018 budgets, we have used our reserves to help fill that gap. The 2019 budget includes $2.9 million in general purposes levy subsidy to be used to fully issue vouchers and to subsidize the administrative costs. So on the other side of the slide is federal appropriations, which lag in timing. We get a certain amount of funding in this calendar year that isn't made up for until the next calendar year when it comes to the voucher side. And then on the administrative side, so the cost to staff the program to actually administer the vouchers, the proration rate doesn't fully cover the cost of staffing to do that. This year, our proration rate is about 77% of actual costs. So the question, of course, is always, is this a long-term problem or is this a short-term problem? We know that our housing voucher deficit is due to rising housing costs in the region, and federal revenue hasn't been keeping pace with increases in our rents in this market. The structure of the housing market would need to change. That would be probably the easiest thing to keep up with that, but we don't get to control that. So we're at the whims of the market. Our research department has been doing quite a bit of research around rents at different bedroom sizes and in different portions of the region, and we're starting to see that perhaps those rents might be leveling off. We hope that that's true and that plays out, but at this point, we're always at the whims of what rents fall in the market. And then just to set you up for your future conversation, and as you know, your budget decisions to support or not support this issue do have an impact both on HRA and on your other decisions around the council. Obviously, kind of leading with the HRA issues, not filling this gap can leave our low-income families kind of in the lurch a bit and have the potential to increase homelessness if we're unable to actually utilize all of our vouchers. It can also have an impact on areas of concentrated poverty in the region. The way that the council has set up our rents is to increase community choice and to allow for higher rents in communities in our service area that have a market for higher rents. So Terry will talk more about those details in her portion, but really providing for a more expansive choice by increasing our rent limits. Of course, spending money here on the HRA limits your ability to spend those dollars in other investments or in other programs that the council has in front of them. In Thrive MSP 2040, there are a number of will statements that the council had included in there that address housing and the HRA and use of vouchers in particular. And Terry will talk more about that in her portion. And then, of course, how we get funded by the federal government in future years. The federal government looks at what we've spent and then matches that in the future year. If we spend less, they will fund us at a lower level. If we spend more, then they will fund us at that level and match that. So it's kind of either a spiral downward or a stepping upward. I wanted to just walk through some of the options that we have examined in the past so you have a sense of the conversation that we've had over the last year in developing the 2019 budget. We did look at a number of different program and budget options. The council HRA is not alone in our funding issues. This is a complicated national and statewide issue, and certainly in collaboration with the other public housing agencies on this map. As you can see, there are 9 others that cover the metro area, and along with other agencies across the state. We're all facing the same federal funding issues, and how do we make ends meet in these times when federal funding is not meeting the administrative costs to run these programs. We've looked at a number of options, including subsidizing the program with council funds, reducing vouchers through attrition, reducing costs through reduced community choice, and securing alternative funding sources. The solution applied in 2019 budget was to subsidize the program with council funds. Terry will discuss these options more in detail later in this presentation. So our overall budget timeline is in front of you, and a large portion of our operating budget goes to support our baseline and core functions such as division level staffing and support from regional administration for services such as IT, legal, and communications. These are the costs that are required to meet our statutory obligations and to execute our programs. We plan to bring a series of policy level operating budget info items to you. These are budget-related items where significant decisions will need to be made this year. And this will include the HRA program, the Parks Equity Grant Program, which we will be discussing later today, the Parks Visitor Study, and the Parks Interest Earnings Distribution. Your feedback will be incorporated into the preliminary division operating budget, and we'll present that information to you in July. So we'll have a series over the next several CDC meetings is where we'll break up each of those discussions and bring them back to you before you see them repackaged as part of kind of the overall CD budget. The division's capital program consists of the parks projects, and we'll bring that back to you later in the second quarter here or in early of the third quarter and provide background and discuss investment options. So before we get into more detailed portions, we wanted to kind of check in and make sure as council members and as decision makers that you have the information that you need to make kind kind of to have the discussions and to make decisions. We want to make sure that you feel like you understand the issues and that you've had the opportunity to ask the questions and to weigh in. So are there other things that you would like for us to know as we move forward, or how best can we support you in this overall budget process? And I think we want to be sure that we're checking in with you with each of the individual budget conversations we're having as well. So this is not your only point to weigh in, is what I'm trying to say, or provide feedback on the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barajas. So are these questions that you're posing directly to the council now and you're looking for feedback, or?
Now and in the future.
Okay. Council members, discussion? It appears not.
Okay.
Great. So I think
Thank
my
you.
guess is they're preparing comments for the future.
Perfect. Well, then I will transition over to Terry and join you up here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ms. Smith, thanks for being here.
Changing of the guard.
Yes.
Good afternoon, council members,
Good
committee
afternoon.
members. My name is Terry Smith, and I'm happy to be here with you today for 2 information items. But the first, digging in a little deeper on the HRA budget, and then I have a second one coming up that will play into some of this budget conversation. And happy to have Heather Agason-Hebner with me. She's the numbers gal, and I'm the program gal. So if you get into technical number questions, she'll be our go-to person. So now that you heard from Lisa a little bit on the background of the HRA budget, I'm going to dig a little deeper with you to get into this issue of where we're having issues with the structural deficit. Essentially, the Metro HRA cannot lease to all of its families within the federal funding provided by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And as Lisa indicated, this is primarily due to the rising costs of housing. The vacancy rates in the Twin Cities region have been at or below 3% since about 2011. And when the vacancy rate is low, rents go up. In fact, landlords get more choosy in terms of who they will rent to, and that's what we're facing today. A healthy vacancy rate is considered 5 to 6%, and the fact that we're hovering around 3%, depending on the area of the region, becomes a problem for the families that we serve. I'll dive a little bit deeper into each one of these, but the council has really faced some difficult choices. For the 19 budget, you will have these opportunities to make these decisions in 2020. But essentially, we have 3 options to deal with our budget issues on the subsidy side, and one is to reduce the program size, so reduce the number of families that we serve. One is to reduce choice in terms of where families can choose to live within the region and whether they can be successful with placing their vouchers. And the other one is to subsidize the program with other council funds to the tune of $1 to $2 million per year. So as Lisa indicated, there's a solution in place, I would say a temporary solution in 2019. And these are the decisions that your prior council members made, but was to fully fund the HRA program to use all vouchers. So to use all vouchers. They committed, the approved 2019 budget includes $2.9 million in general purpose levy, and the goal of that is meant to be sort of a temporary bridge. So we have the opportunity to have more discussion and dialogue with partners in the region and you all in terms of a longer term solution. The decision was made to maintain exception rent communities. You might wonder what that is. In a couple of slides, I'll dig a little bit deeper into that with you to talk about what that means, but it really allows for the families that have vouchers choice in terms of where they live in the region. And then adopting high enough rent limits to ensure voucher success. I'll dig into that a little bit deeper in a couple of slides, help you understand how we set rent limits for the voucher program and the voucher holders. And then the council provided direction to attempt to explore alternative funding discussions, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So in this slide, I hope to provide you with some clarity around how average subsidy costs play into the whole budget discussion. So the council will receive about $50 million this year in 2019 to make housing payments on behalf of the families that we serve. HUD says, here's your money, so here's your $59 million. Now go out and serve as many families as you can with that money. The number of families that we can serve is impacted by the average per family cost. So on the chart on the right, I have 3 different average per family subsidy costs and how that plays out into numbers. So under all these scenarios, we're using $59 million budget. So if, for example, our average per family subsidy is $720, so that's the average payment we're making on behalf of all 7,000 families that we serve. If it's 720, and we take that with the 59 million, we can serve 6,700 families with the 59 million we get. If our average per family subsidy goes up to $730 per family, it reduces the number of families we can serve to about 6,600. And you can see yet again, if our average subsidy increases to 740, will reduce even more the number of families we can serve to 6,500. So essentially what this slide is showing you is that a $20 increase in average subsidy equates to about service to 200 less families. So this is where the choice comes in and where you'll have some opportunity to weigh into this discussion later in the year as we're developing the 2020 budget and as you consider rent limits for the voucher program. And as Lisa indicated, the federal funding for this year is dependent on spending for last year. So, this year, spend more this year, get more next year. Spend less this year, get less next year. Same thing with the number of families we serve. If we chose not to subsidize the program, we're serving less families. That means we'll get less money next year and we'll serve less and less and less and less. And it just becomes this step down approach that is not good for any of us. But that's sort of how average rents play into this. Another piece of this puzzle is the rent limits for the program. So you all, as council policymakers, have some discretion in terms of where we set rent limits. Rent limits are set by housing authorities across the country. So the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development charges housing authorities with setting rent limits, which are based on federal fair market rents. So about each September, October each year, HUD issues fair market rents. And then they charge housing authorities with reviewing their rent limits. We have to make sure they're within a certain limit. And then you all as policymakers will make decisions on where we set those rent limits. If we set higher rent limits, these are the things that happen. So higher rent limits mean, and rent limits, I should say, are really the dollar amount that families have when they're out shopping for a rental unit. So if we set higher rent limits, that's more in line with what the market's doing today. So when families are out shopping for a unit, they have more units to choose from, number one, but they also have more community choice. But then it means that fewer vouchers are issued. So we could serve less families unless there's a decision made to subsidize with other funding. There's increased choice for family because it opens up a larger number of units that may be available in the market, and then it builds future year funding. If the decision were made to adopt lower rent limits, that means when families are out shopping for a unit with their voucher, the pool of available units becomes less, so fewer units are available. They have less community choice. Conversely, we can serve more families, but if the families aren't able to find any units, then that sort of doesn't work. But then it risks future year funding. So spend less, get less, spend less, get less. And you will have an opportunity again in about September we'll dig much deeper into this issue, and you'll have some policy decisions to make. So when we talk about voucher costs and average voucher costs, because of the steep increases in rents in our region over the last several years, our average cost per voucher increased from $671 in 2016, and today it's at $742. So that's a huge increase. And, I've been doing this work a long time, and it's the steepest increase I've ever seen. It's a 10% over 2 years. A more normal or a typical increase is about 2% per year. An increase in costs, which is still an increase, but it's much more manageable. And so we're in a deeper conundrum in this environment than we have been historically in the past. The good news, as Lisa indicated, our research department has done lots of analysis on what market rents are doing in our region, and they're starting to taper off. So rents aren't going down. I've never seen them go down too much, but they're starting to taper off and more grow in line with inflation, which is really a good thing for our programs and the families we serve, so we can have a more manageable budget. I think the important thing to point out as we talk about voucher costs is even if we have an increase of 2% per year, as Lisa indicated, there's a lag in our funding because this year's funding is spent based on last year's spending. We have that 2% lag. So we're always going to have a lag unless HUD changes the funding formula for one reason or another. But I think the good news is we've spent, as Lisa indicated, our own money reserves in 2017 and 2018, and we have recaptured that funding in the next year, which is a good sign for our budget. So we've been growing our budget, but it's not a long-term solution. And I think without the council approval of the rent limits where they are today, the council approved the current rent limits back in October of 2018. And without approving those, we would have all these vouchers coming back because families would be out there shopping for units with unrealistic rent limits attached to them. So Lisa went into this a little bit, but there were some policy options examined in 2019 with the prior council. We had lots of dialogue and information items with Heather and I and Lisa and some of the other budget staff to the council members to weigh these options. And we went through them a little bit, but it's about either reducing the program size to match the budget, it's subsidizing with council funds, and then it's also about maintaining these exception rent communities. So under reducing program size, when we had dialogue with the council members, we were never proposing to terminate families from the program. In order to stay within budget, we would have to serve about 200 families less, and we could accomplish that through monthly attrition. So the HRA turns over about 50 to 60 vouchers every single month, and so we would accomplish reduced program size through that effort in that way. But again, the council chose to dedicate some additional funding to utilize all vouchers, so that's our path for 2019. One of the things I haven't talked about is when we set rent limits, the council and the HRA, we have discretion in terms of what rent limits are for different communities. And we knew that voucher families were struggling to find units in high rent communities. And so back in about, I think it was 2011, and to this day, we have adopted higher rent limits for higher rent communities, and we call those exception rent communities. And a good example of that could be, it costs one thing for a family to rent a 2-bedroom in, for example, Columbia Heights. It costs something different for them to rent a 2-bedroom unit in, for example, Edina. And so adopting these exception payment standards or rent limits allows families with more choice in terms of where they place their voucher. And this policy decision also supports the Thrive 24, some will statements that are listed in Thrive 2040, which says that the council will offer housing options that give people in all life stages viable choices for stable housing. And then the second part is that the council will develop and provide tools, including competitive rent limits and higher cost communities, to enable voucher holders to choose a location that best meets their needs. So it's really about family choice. One of the things I like council members to know is providing that choice for these exception rent communities costs about $1 million a year. So because those rents in those communities are higher, it costs the housing authority more to have families live in those communities. And the current exception communities are listed here at the bottom. And we arrive at those by we review rental data by community for all of the communities that the HRA services and the average rents. And we'll dig into that more later this year when I bring forward a rent limits discussion. So program performance, I just wanted to stick this in here because I think it's an important piece of the pie, but it's important that we run an efficient agency and that we do good work. The HRA has been rated as a high performer from our federal partners for 15 straight years. And so it's really about, we're running a lean ship. We're doing what we can to serve the families. We do in the most efficient way possible, and we continue to look at program efficiencies, and we'll continue to go forward. HUD completed an assessment back in 2014 and studied high-performing agencies across the country to determine what it costs to run a good voucher program, and the council's HRA was part of that study. And the results of that study came back, and it had a whole myriad of things, but one of the items that came back is that for our size agency, we should have 47 frontline staff to operate our program, and today we have 39. And I think we can do that because of the tremendous efficiencies we've implemented within our department, and some of them are listed here, but it's about taking advantage of the federal rule flexibility that we have. And some of those are listed here. We implemented a new housing software system that is, we're completely paperless. So our staff used to carry around files this thick and we'd pass them from person to person and payments, and we'd lose files, and then, it just took a tremendous amount of time. For inspections, we used to do paper inspections. Now all of our inspectors have iPads, and when they enter the inspection data, it immediately uploads to our software so a caseworker can see immediately when an inspection passes. It allows for more efficient reporting. We have online waiting list management, which Jennifer will talk about in one of the information items tonight, which creates much efficiency, which some of the things she'll talk about I think will be kind of shocking. We have streamlined quality control processes. HUD allows us to do biennial inspections, which means inspecting units every other year instead of every year. And we've taken advantage of some of that, although I think we could do more. So I think it's important to say we run an efficient program, and we'll continue to do so as much as possible to keep up with the reduced federal funding environment. So up next, as I indicated, we're always looking at better ways to serve our families and more efficient ways of doing our business. We had what's called an operational assessment done during the month of March. So we hired a consultant who came in to look at all of our business practices, our business process, our policies, our systems, and really with the idea of and the goal of identifying opportunity areas for efficiency. We've been doing this work a long time, and although we're connected locally and nationally with what other housing authorities are doing, this national consultant we thought could provide a broader look and an outside look at our practices. And we just got the report back, and it has some really good ideas in there that we will now be digesting and determining which ones make sense to implement, and some of those will require discussions with you for policy changes, written policy changes, and so we'll be excited to share some of those with you in the future. We plan to expand our biennial inspections. We intend to expand the use of inspection certifications. So when a unit fails an inspection, instead of sending an inspector out to re-inspect the unit to make sure it's in compliance with safety standards, we can have the tenant owner sign a certification. We only do that with non-life-threatening health and safety items, but we can expand that. So some of the things that we're doing and will continue to do are here. I think one of the important things to mention is convening regional policymakers. As Lisa indicated, this problem is not unique to our agency. It's nationally, all housing authorities are experiencing the same thing. So how can we collaborate together to reduce costs and gain efficiencies? I think the other important note is the council's Metro HRA. Lisa showed you a map in the beginning. We serve part of the region, and we serve suburban locations. And the council general fund levy is collected from the entire region. And so some council members have expressed concern about committing general fund dollars to our program that only serves part of the region. However, voucher holders have this component where they can take their voucher and move wherever they want in the region. So we have families moving to Minneapolis, St. Paul, Dakota County, all over the place. So I think there's an argument to be made that there needs to be a broader pool, and how can we figure out how to share the costs on a regional basis. And then, of course, advocating for full program funding is an important step. The funding for the voucher program is the lowest it's been in the 40-year history of the program. And so lobbying for full funding is an important piece for us. And I'm going to stop talking.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Thank you for the report. Questions? Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've been facing HRA budget deficits for quite some time. We spent down reserves, and last year we had a big discussion about whether to use council funds to fill the gap. The council is not a housing agency. We're providing the processing of the vouchers for communities that don't want to process their own. But there are other parts of the region that do their own: Minneapolis, St. Paul, Bloomington, Dakota County, Washington County, Scott County. So those places are figuring out their own problems and funding or not funding that deficit, either cutting vouchers or funding the deficit out of their local funds. But the only way that when we use general fund money is we're levying it across the entire metro area. And so the other places that are solving their own local problems are also contributing to that general fund, which is paying for only a portion of the metro area that we're providing this service to. So the council had a lot of discussion about talking to those other places, the suburban Hennepin, suburban Ramsey, about Carver County, about were they willing to step in and fund that gap, or did we need to look for other solutions? That wasn't able to happen in a timely manner last year, so we did this temporary general fund thing. Have there been any discussions with those places about whether they want to fund that gap? Even because I'm assuming there's still going to be a gap even after you come up with all your efficiencies. Are they interested in funding that gap, or have those conversations not occurred? Because if they haven't occurred, I'm worried about that, because we couldn't fix it last time because we didn't have time to have the conversation. Now we're rolling through another budget cycle, and if we haven't started having those conversations, we need to start immediately.
Ms. Smith?
So, Mr. Chair and council member, I should note that some of the programs that the HRA operates, we operate throughout the entire region. And so the voucher program, we serve suburban areas and people are moving all over. So you can say we serve the entire region, but we have several smaller programs where we're serving city of St. Paul, city of Minneapolis, Dakota County, the entire region. I should also say that there have been conversations at the housing authority level. So there's a voucher utilization working group that has been meeting since last fall to talk about these common issues and how we can work together as housing agencies to do more with less in terms of recruiting landlords, streamlining processes related to people, families that are moving back and forth between our agencies, and how can we do that in a more simple way. So some of those conversations have happened. I think because of couple of things with the changeover in council, the policymaker to policymaker conversations have not happened yet. And that's something that's on the chair's radar. And I anticipate those conversations will be happening soon. But I think the conversation at the council level last year was that these conversations need to be policymaker to policymaker. And I'll defer to Lisa if she has any other things to add.
Ms. Bras?
Mr. Chair, council member, that's exactly what I would add to. The transition has made that policymaker to policymaker discussion difficult, but certainly would encourage folks, council members who represent those areas as well, to join us in that conversation, or certainly connect with me or Terry on and what it takes to have that kind of that conversation and what that might look like. We'd be happy to meet with you offline.
Councilmember Wolf, anything further?
Well, despite all of the changeover and stuff, we're running out of time to have that conversation. And $2.9 million is it's 20% of our general fund. That's a big amount of money to be filling one gap in funding for something that isn't actually our region-wide service. We were asked to process these for certain communities. Those same communities also have their voucher people moving to other communities as well. So saying that some of those vouchers move to Minneapolis or whatever doesn't really get at the root of the issue, that this deficit is not for the entire region. On some smaller programs it might be, but for the main Section 8 voucher deficit that we're having, it is for only a portion of the region. And both Councilmember Barber and I were very clear that, yeah, we would vote for one time but we need, I just want to make sure people understand how urgent it is to have that conversation, because we can't just keep doing this year after year. We have a very limited general fund that goes up very slowly, and it has a lot of other pressures. So continuing to fix this problem with the general fund is not a viable option.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mostly a comment rather than a question. Thank you very much. This is really, really helpful to get this overview and perspective. It's also really helpful to have Ms. Wolf's carry forward from last year with the historical perspective, which we don't know. But, you know, obviously, stable housing is critical and critically important, and really decides the success of the family, and children being able to have a stable education and being able to get and maintain job situations. I mean, there's so many things, and then the lack of affordable housing, which we're all aware of, has so many spillover effects into other programs and so forth. And the balancing of if this, then that, all of that information is so important. So I thank you for your presentation, and Ms. Bras for yours as well, because I think understanding that it's such a complex issue, and the depth of the complexity is certainly new to me, perhaps others. And so I thank you for that, and I really look forward to having further in-depth discussions on what the options are and what that means, if this, then that. So thank you very much. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen, and then Councilmember Chambliss.
I'd kind of like to know at what point in order for us to take advantage of any ideas or collaboration or to bring others into the fold, when do those conversations need to take place? Is it right now? Is it this summer? Or is it when? Yeah.
Ms. Smith?
Chair and council member, it's now. It's been now, and I think part of it is we've had staff level conversations about this, and with other agencies. I think it just is critical that it's policymaker to policymaker, but I would say the time is now.
Councilmember.
So maybe this is a question for our body as our committee. Do we make a motion asking that those conversations take place, or I'm gonna look at you, Chair, because I don't know. Like,
So,
what do
and
we do?
and I will turn to Ms. Braz. I mean, this is something that we need help framing with and
Yeah.
sort of scheduling out, but it is, I mean, I know the longer you defer making a decision, the deeper the cut will be, you know, and so I guess I would turn for guidance to the director.
Mr. Chair, council members, your conversation is direction enough for us. We will continue to work with, and we'll reach out to other council members who are not on this committee or who are not here today that also are within our service area, and speak with them offline.
And it would seem to me that since it does impact the entire region, it's council members that aren't in this in our service area as well will need to be engaged. I mean, that was quite a vote to take, I'm sure, to fund this deficit, and so.
Just as a follow-up to that, I guess I'm wondering not so much about the council member roles. I mean, that, yes, that part, yes. And I'm wondering about this piece about policy maker to policymaker. What I'm hearing in that is it's that these conversations need to be happening at the regional administrator chair of the council to those communities. So I'm thinking that's the piece. Do we need a motion asking that the chair take on and have that conversation asking?
So I would, again, defer to the director's guidance that this conversation is the direction rather than taking a motion. And my guess is those conversations are happening now, and how we engage them, and that's kind of what I'm interested in. Did you have something, Ms. Bras?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, council members, we have briefed our chair when she first came on board, and she obviously was waiting for the rest of you to all be appointed as well. So she is familiar, it's on her radar, and I think that now that folks are kind of settled in, we can re-engage her on that as well, and I'll connect with the regional administrator on this.
Thanks for help with that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I have quite a list of council members waiting to speak. So Councilmember Chambliss, then Lee, then Benton.
Yes, I just have a question and perhaps a request. The voucher utilization work group that you mentioned, I would like to hear about their recommendations and kind of have them get some information about what their thoughts were and what they were pushing for. So is it
Yes, ma'am.
possible to get that information?
Ms. Smith.
So, Mr. Chair and Councilmember Chambliss, the work group was put together by the Corporation for Supportive Housing, and it
Okay.
came about, there were some new federal funding opportunities. You may recall a conversation about these mainstream vouchers that the council received for serving the homeless persons that are utilizing the transit system as shelter. There was another federal funding opportunity that some agencies could not apply for because their utilization on existing program wasn't where it needed to be. And so they gathered a group of housing authorities. So it's essentially the 10 housing authorities here in the region that get together, probably been 4 times now, to talk about what can we do as like portability, which is when people are moving back and forth. What can we do to streamline that process, to ease administrative burden on the housing authority, but also to ease the process for families that are moving across jurisdictional lines. For example, they get a 2-bedroom in our service area and they go to St. Paul and they get a 3-bedroom or vice versa. So how can we align some of those policies? So for example, there's a chart of all of our main policy topics and the differences between the 10 agencies. So it's those kinds of things to begin conversations about aligning programs to make them easier to administer and easier to maneuver for tenants and landlords.
Okay.
Thank you. Councilmember Lee.
Oh, thank you, Chair. When I applied for this position, both in my application and my interview, I made it clear to the governor that the issue of solving the regional issue of homelessness and affordable housing was one of the major tenets of my platform. I grew up poor in one of the poorest counties in this country, in Fresno County in Central Valley of California. And, a lot of cities, there's no regional planning authority there. Cities don't work together. And we have an opportunity as a really powerful, strong body to affect this issue. I have some ideas, but I want to, and questions, but I want to research them more before I relay it to the staff. But that's a really important issue to me. And I think we got to help. It really is a truly regional issue to me because post the Great Recession, we know for a fact that both homelessness and poverty has grown in the suburbs. And so it's not just an issue of the core cities. And so we have to think about how we can help bring the suburbs along too. But I am really interested in this issue.
Thank you, Councilmember. I have in queue Councilmembers Vento and Lindstrom. Councilmember Vento.
Mr. Chair, I want to concur with what Councilmember Lee just said, and also kind of reinforce the idea of One Minnesota. While our responsibilities and jurisdiction is limited to the metro area, I've got to believe that this is a statewide issue as well. And given that federal funding is such a critical factor in this, in addition to having conversations with local and regional policymakers, I think we also need to think as a council about how to have conversations statewide that include the members of the Minnesota congressional delegation so that we're correcting some of these funding messes from the federal level. Because from what I can gather, if you're spending all of your current year funding and then maybe more, and you're getting all of those vouchers used, that's great. But if the funding levels aren't increasing from year to year, a 10% increase over 2 years is going to still bite you. So, and I worry about what's being proposed for housing in the current budget debate out there. So, just a thought that we need to keep the current decision making at the federal level on our radar.
Thank you, Councilmember. Ms. Smith, you said something earlier, and I jotted it down. And so you said I think you said that the federal funding is at the lowest level in 40 years. Is that a dollar amount, or is that in a percentage of increase, or what? What are you basing that on, please?
Mr. Chair, so every year from the federal government's congressional appropriations, we get the funding for the voucher program. We get a subsidy pot to pay rents for the families, and then we get a pot of administrative dollars to pay our salaries. And the so the proration levels is what I'm talking about.
Okay.
So this administrative funding has gone down, down, down. historically, it's been prorated at, 95% for years and years and years and years, 90%. And back in 2011, it took a tank and we were funded at 69% on the dollar. And then since then, we've had years at 75%. This year's at 80% proration. So we're getting 80% of our paycheck essentially. And what's happening is because Congress doesn't want to be on the front page of the paper saying they're evicting families, they tend to fund the voucher pool and then they just keep cutting on the administrative side. So essentially the, funding for the program, you know, uh, is when I say it's the lowest in the history of the program, it's this administrative
I see.
proration that I'm talking about. So hundreds of housing authorities have given their programs back to HUD because they can't make ends meet with these lower fees.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very helpful. Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're talking about reducing program size. We're talking about subsidizing the program, and you also threw out the idea of alternative funding sources. I'm hoping you can just expand on that. When you say that, that's a very enticing thing. And what does that mean to you? What are the possibilities?
Mr. Chair, council member, so where's the bag of cash, right?
Yeah.
That's a good question, but I think it gets at the conversations that we're talking about having with regional partners, whether it's the counties, the cities, in terms of helping support the program dollars. But, and part of it is the reality of that. We don't really know that that is a reality, but those are additional sources of funding. Is there some state funding we can get to support the voucher program? So it's additional funding sources that we don't know if they're there or not. It's just about getting out there and trying to figure out if there's more money that we can capture for this. For example, there have been grant opportunities to support voucher holders that we're applying for to help our voucher holders be successful in finding a home. And so some of those grant opportunities we will go after to find money wherever we can. I don't know if you want to add to that, Heather, from a budget perspective.
No, Mr. Chair,
Ms.
committee
Asen
members,
Hebert.
I think it's there's no magic bag of cash. And I think we still need to do our due diligence and explore and make sure that we're not leaving any opportunity unturned. And I think that's where we're at right now.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When the council started doing these vouchers for the communities, the federal government did essentially fully fund it. So this has been a gradual kind of like bleeding out, and we're at the point of transfusions. And I think, staff has worked really, really hard to find ways to fix the problem, getting flexibility to try to change the rules. Looking under the couch cushions. I mean, they've looked everywhere for places to fix the problem. The reason I want to have the conversation with the local jurisdictions that we're providing these vouchers for is to have them be allowed to have a stake in the conversation and what's going on in their communities. They're in their budget discussions right now too, and we need to find out whether there's any room in their budget to make sure that these continue to be fully funded. Because we've worked very hard to make sure we maximize the number of vouchers that we're utilizing and giving maximum choice to the voucher holders so that they can use the vouchers and not turn them back in and be unsuccessful. But in order to keep doing that, the cities have to or county, whatever level you want, because it's suburban Hennepin, suburban Ramsey, all of Carver that are in this in Anoka County, are they too?
Mm-hmm.
So some of the conversations might have to be at a city level, some might have to be at a county level, but talking to them about, are your values aligned with ours, and are you willing to cough up this extra gap in the funding so that we can keep maximizing the utilization of the vouchers? Because otherwise, if we don't have that conversation, we don't know if that's in our toolbox when we're doing our budget at the end of the year. That was something that we wished we were able to do last year, but at some point we had to have that conversation so we know that if that's something in the toolbox or not.
Thank you. Thank you. Further discussion on this report? Further discussion? Seeing none, thanks Ms. Smith, thanks Ms. Eggeson-Huebner, and we'll move on to the next information item, which is you again, I believe, Ms. Smith, Metro HRA Moving to Work Demonstration Program.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. And this next presentation will get at some of this. This is one of the creative things that HRA is trying to accomplish to gain flexibility in terms of the way federal rent assistance is administered. And so this is an information item for you today. My intention is to go through this with you today and then hopefully come back on May 20th for an action item, and I'll tell you about what that means. So the presentation is about getting a moving to work designation for the council's HRA. And the moving to work program is a federal designation that allows public housing authorities the flexibility to design and test innovative strategies, really changing the way federal rent assistance is administered. So moving to work agencies have the ability to waive certain federal regulations, to adopt flexible rules for their programs, and actually change the rules. It also provides flexibility in how we spend our money for our programs. There are 3,300 public housing agencies nationally, and 39 of them have this moving to work designation, and they've had it for many years. It was part of a 1998 congressional bill that allowed this moving to work program, but there hasn't been an expansion in many, many years. And one of the moving to work agencies is right here in our region, Minneapolis Public Housing Authority. And if you see the dot in Minnesota, when HUD developed this map, I don't think they know where Minneapolis is. So what is moving to work? So moving to work, again, provides flexibility in how we manage and operate our programs. But it's really from very minor administrative or policy changes to whole new program design and program reform. For example, we could simplify rent calculation processes if we had this designation. We could ease administrative process. We could simplify medical deductions. We literally have some people that bring in big shoe boxes of medical receipts at their recertification time that we have to go through and calculate. So there are easier ways to do some of these things that are required in the federal regulations. On the other side of the extreme, we can do whole new program design. We can develop a whole new program, partnership with the school district, or really do anything we want. And there are pages and pages of approved MTW activities that these 39 agencies across the country are testing and doing, and there's a whole list of them that we want here at the council. There are some statutory requirements of all moving to work agencies, and so all moving to work agencies must adopt activities that meet these criteria. So they have to achieve greater cost effectiveness. So it's about reducing the cost of administering the programs. It's about increasing housing choice for families. So one of the goals is we need to make sure we're increasing housing choice for families and not decreasing housing choice. It's to help residents make progress towards self-sufficiency. We have to ensure that at least 75% of the families we serve are meeting that lowest income level, which is a current requirement. It's these last three things are things that HUD says you still need to meet these requirements. We still need to make sure our units are safe for our families. So having these flexibilities in our program would really change the way we do our work, and it would shift it from administrative process to family success. I'll give you an example of that. So if we were able to, for example, recertify our families every 3 years instead of every year as currently required, that would create money savings and time savings such that we could put our money and energy towards other things, like adopting higher rent limits so that families have full choice in terms of where they live. There are two ways that the council's HRA can obtain this moving to work designation. Both of them are through the 2016 Consolidated Appropriations Act. It's taken HUD a couple of years to get these off the ground. But one of them, and there's language in the 2016 Appropriations Act that allows the HUD secretary to expand existing MTW designations to adjacent agencies. So under this scenario, we can make, and we did, and that's the next bullet, make a formal request to HUD to have Minneapolis Public Housing Authorities moving to work designation extended to the council's HRA. So it means we would get the flexibilities of the MTW program through them. And so last year we had some conversations with our previous council, and in August of 2018, with their approval, we submitted a formal request to HUD to have their MTW powers, if you will, extended to the council's HRA. Although the dialogue is occurring, we've had several conference calls and written communications back and forth with HUD. I would say the federal government shutdown stalled it a little bit, and now they've picked it back up, and the dialogue is starting again. So that's one way we could achieve getting this MTW status. The second way is also authorized under the 2016 Consolidated Appropriations Act, and the rulemaking and notices have just recently come out from HUD on this. And so under the Appropriations Act, it authorizes HUD to expand the Moving to Work program to an additional 100 agencies in the country. So giving an additional 100 agencies MTW designation. HUD issued a notice on March 14th of this year, and I'll get into that in the next slide. But it's all about expanding to these next 100 agencies. When Congress authorized HUD to expand the program, they are requiring that the MTW expansion will be offered in 4 separate cohorts, each offered separately and testing different policy innovations. And so those are listed here. The first cohort was offered in late 2018, and that was to test the Moving to Work program flexibilities as a whole. So having all the opportunity to adopt all the activities and the pages and pages of opportunities that I talked about. But that notice was only applicable to small agencies, less than 1,000 units. Of the 39 Moving to Work agencies in the country, they're all very large agencies. And so what HUD wanted to do with this expansion is allow some smaller housing authorities to test some program innovations. On March 14th, HUD issued a notice for the rent reform cohort, and that's the one I'm going to focus on today with you all. So under this rent reform cohort, which I will get into in the next slide, but letters of intent are due to HUD by June 12th for this cohort. Under this cohort, HUD will award 30 additional agencies to award them with MTW designations. Only 3 of them will be large, which is us. So that's over 6,000 units, 6,000 vouchers. And so although we think we have a good shot because we're doing lots of the self-sufficiency activities that HUD is looking for in these designations and really promoting family self-sufficiency, so we think we could have a good application. And then the third and fourth cohorts are, one will be testing work requirements. I think there will be something about requiring families to work, and it may be something about incentivizing families to work, but that notice is not out yet. And then the fourth one will be to test landlord incentives. So do providing landlord incentives make a difference for families, because it would increase the opportunities for families and the landlords that would accept vouchers. But neither of those are issued yet. So under the rent reform notice, HUD laid out 3 options for rent reform for housing authorities to consider. And those are listed here. And so in the letter of intent that is submitted to HUD, housing authorities need to let HUD know which ones of these in the order of preference would a housing authority be willing to test. And the first one is a tiered rent approach. And this is where a housing authority would establish income-based tiers in $2,500 increments. We would verify a person's income. They would pay 35% of their income corresponding with the $2,500 tier. So instead of calculating rent down to the penny, we would place people in tiers. So if your income is this, you pay this. If your income is this, you pay this, and it's about 30% of their income. The requirement under that is that the housing authority adopt a minimum rent of $50 per participant. We do not have a minimum rent currently, but that would be a requirement of that rent reform alternative. The second 2 are a little bit more unclear to me, but one of them is a 3% stepped rent increase annually and one is a 5% stepped rent increase annually. So on year one, under these second two scenarios, rent would be based on their current income-based rent. So today their participants are paying 30% of their income towards rent. They would be placed, pay the rent that they're paying today in their income-based rent on year one. So if my rent is $300 today, that's where I'd be placed in the steps, and I'd pay $300 for year one under the stepped rent. Then every year after that, the resident would experience a 3% increase in rent. And that happens until the resident gets to full fair market rent. So it's like an 18-year process. Conversely, or the same scenarios with the 5% step increase. So instead of having 3% incremental increases every single year, they would have a 5% increase in rent every single year. Under the 3%, it's a $24 increase in rent every year, and under the 5%, it's a $40 increase every year. The key to this is it's not income based. So it's not based on their income except for that year one. So the goal of these two programs in HUD's eyes is to help families move towards self-sufficiency and move towards being free of public rent assistance. Excluded are people that are elderly or disabled. So the rent reform would only be conducted with families that are not elderly or not disabled. The other thing is there are some hardship exemptions for all of these scenarios, but they're limited. And so people can have X number of full hardship exemptions or full or partial hardship exemptions. There's a lot that's unclear with this. The notice is, maybe 7 pages long. So it doesn't give us near enough information to make a good business decision if this is good for the council or the families that we serve. So that's the second way we can get moving to work designation. I thought it might be helpful to show a chart sort of showing the considerations of each option. So on the left is the initiative with Minneapolis Public Housing Authority and continuing down the path and dialogue with HUD to get their MTW status extended to the council's HRA. And then on the right is the expansion cohort rent reform initiative. So I think it makes sense to travel both paths until we have enough information to make a good business decision of which one is better for us and the families we serve. But on the left, I think that MPHA initiative, as I indicated, hasn't been done anywhere in the country. And so it requires our federal partners, HUD, to be real creative in thinking how we can set this up. So there are no details on it. There's no written notices on how to have this work. So we're essentially with HUD in Minneapolis making it up as we go along to see how we can create this partnership to serve families better. The second thing I have there is, there will be a requirement for memorandums of understanding, cooperative agreements, cross-jurisdictional collaboration, much of what we're doing now, but there takes time to develop how this partnership will work. This is a big question for me. The third thing is, will HUD agree to allow our agencies, Minneapolis and the council, to maintain separate financial reporting, separate renewal funding, and independent governance structures? So our request is we want to maintain independent agencies with independent operating structures, but we want to collaborate to serve families better is kind of how we've formed this to HUD. So that's a remaining question. And if the council has to flow at $65 million through Minneapolis Public Housing, that will probably be a deal breaker for us. So some of those things are unknown. And then collaboration is already happening with MPHA. We're doing lots of things with them with our, we both have a mobility program. We're doing some things with that. We have a national research partner that we're working with together on voucher mobility in concentrated areas of poverty and low poverty areas in the region. So we're doing lots with them already. So this will build on those relationships. And then on the other side, we have the expansion cohort rent reform. Submitting a letter of interest does not commit us to anything. In fact, the council's not committed to anything under either one of these options today. And before any commitment is made, we'll be back to you with further dialogue and policy discussions. So when if we submit a letter of interest to HUD by June 12th, HUD will then look at all the letters of interest in a select number of agencies, and it's unclear how many. will be selected to then provide a full application. And we're thinking those full application materials will provide us with more of the detail that we all want to know. And then we also know that they're only going to be selecting 3 large agencies, but we think we have a good shot. And then I think this is a key. Housing authorities that are selected under the rent reform cohort, it's clear that we will not have access to all of the MTW activities. So we'll have to forego some of those, activities, pages and pages worth, but we don't know what they are. The notice was very vague in terms of which one, because if we're going to test rent reform, we're going to want to adopt other policy flexibilities that go along with that to serve our families better. So until we know what those are, those excluded activities are, we can't really make any good decisions. Robust research and evaluation are required for all of these new cohorts, and so we'll have to establish national research partners, which we already have. I don't envision a problem with that, but there is a robust research component to this, which we're not doing right now. And then even if the council is not awarded MTW, we will continue our collaboration with Minneapolis and hoping to loop in other agencies with our partnerships. So the next steps in this is back to you all, the Community Development Committee, depending on your feedback today, on May 20th, to ask for your approval to submit the letter of interest to HUD by June 12th. And that requires a board resolution, so we would go to the full council on May 22nd. Then, as I indicated, HUD will review the letters of interest, invite a select number of agencies back to do a full application. Still doesn't commit us to anything, but it will probably give us more detail. Then if we're approved by HUD, then we will come before you. We will get your approval to be an MTW designated agency. But the biggest piece of all this is to develop our moving to work plan. So it talks about which activities we want to adopt. It will have a large engagement piece with you all, but also with the families that we serve and communities to determine what activities make sense for us and the families we serve. And then if the other option is followed with MPHA, there will be all those agreements to enter into with Minneapolis to allow us to work cross-jurisdictionally, and you will be involved in part of that process too. And that's what I have, Mr. Chair, for prepared comments.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Questions? Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Can you share a little bit more about what it means to move to self-sufficiency, and just in looking about programs like this, there's a lot of requirements of the folks living in the units, who would be supporting them and or overseeing their participation to remain eligible.
Ms. Smith.
Mr. Chair and Council Member, so part of this is, and I'll use our own mobility counseling program that we have in place, where we're working with a subset of our voucher holders and working towards goals and self-sufficiency. And what we do is we have an individualized meeting with program participants, and that program is voluntary that we have right now, but we meet with participants, determine what opportunity means for them. We do individualized goal setting with families to determine what goals they have and what they want to accomplish in their life. And then we do help them develop these goals, get them set up with resources, and then we do check-ins with them on obtaining their goals and helping getting them connected to resources. And so it's, we can determine as a council and as the policymakers, you will be involved in determining how we want to structure this. It's not like HUD says, here's what you need to do. HUD says the initiative is to have families work towards self-sufficiency, and we will define, we collectively, how we want to have that work.
Councilmember?
I just want to make sure we get to the second part of that. So or maybe I missed it. It's we who would be doing all that support work, as you're saying that's what you do now for self-sufficiency. But in this program, the additional requirements around like actively looking for work and things like that and monitoring those actions would be things that we would do then as well.
Ms. Smith?
So, Mr. Chair and Council Member, I think the work requirements and work incentives and all the monitoring in terms of moving towards work, I think will come more in that third cohort, which is testing work requirements. We're testing rent reform. That's the main goal of this, is to test rent reform. But what HUD wants to see is, what are we doing as an agency to help families move towards self-sufficiency? So maybe it's that we provide tenant education and financial literacy classes for voucher holders. Maybe it's that we open that up for all voucher holders to assist them in moving towards self-sufficiency. So it's an agency decision in terms of how we want to set that up. And when the details of this program come out, we'll come back with some recommendations and be in dialogue with you in terms of how we set that up. But that's what I mean by we will decide.
Okay. Just one last follow-up, Chair. What is our success rate now at moving people to off public support and into self-sufficiency?
Ms. Smith?
Mr. Chair and Council Member, I don't know the percentage right offhand, and sometimes it's hard to know because we track, when people go off the program, we track the reasons they exit the program, and in many cases we call it a voluntary drop. We don't necessarily know why they voluntary drop. Is it because they no longer need the assistance? We also have a pool of applicant or participants that reach the income limit where they no longer qualify. And I don't know the percentages off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to send that to you.
Okay.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Wolf and then Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The step rent thing, so even if your income goes up, say you get a raise or a better job or whatever, and your income goes up by 10%, your rent would still only go up by 3 or 5. Is that how it works?
Mr. Chair, Council Member Wolf, that's accurate.
Thank you. Councilmember Chambliss.
A couple of comments. I'm very happy to hear that this is coming up as an action item for the council, and to know that as soon as possible is very helpful for us in the Community Development Committee and also the council as a whole. The sooner they get that information, I think the better. Also, I'm very excited to know that we're looking at creative options to manage the rent increases that we know have happened and have occurred, and having a chance to look at rent reform, even though we don't have a lot of detail from them about what the role would be of the council. I'm glad to see that we're moving forward as a part of this pilot, and look forward to getting more detail.
Thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Lindstrom.
This is a bit of a scary thought, but so we're talking about joining forces with Minneapolis. Was there ever any discussion about the other HRAs in the region? There's probably already a lot of cooks in the kitchen. That's why I mean it's a little scary. But any thought on that?
Ms. Smith.
Mr. Chair and Council Member, yes, there was dialogue with all 10 housing authorities within the region, and we had conversations with all of them, and nobody was ready to join on at this time. I think the whole unknown piece scared some people away, but the way I look at it, and I think your prior policymakers looked at it, is we're not committing to anything. And the bottom line is it has to work for the council and the people that we serve, or we're not going to do it. And so the example I gave with commingling funds, I think that scared some people off, but it's not going to work like that, or we're not going to do it. So I think we have a real opportunity here to shape the way this regionalization can be done in the country, and I think it's to our advantage to work through that, see if we can't craft some creative collaboration to be used as a national example, really.
Thank you. Further discussion? Further discussion? Seeing none, thanks very much, Ms. Smith. And I also just want to tell the committee members, just going back to the earlier conversation about the HRA budget, and I just had a quick conversation with Ms. Barajas here about following up with the chair and making sure that these conversations are happening in a timely manner, and I'll commit to the committee members to follow up as well. Cool, thank you. Moving on to the Metro HRA waiting list opening, Ms. Keogh, is that?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Keogh, welcome.
Thank Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Council, or Mr. Chair and council members. My name is Jennifer Keogh for the record, and I'm the manager of the Metro HRA. This is my first time presenting to the new council, so I have a great pleasure to discuss some big items with you today. And that is the opening of the Metro HRA's Housing Choice Voucher waiting list. And I forget 9 times out of 10 that there's no one clicking my slides. So just, start staring at me and I'll remember that I have not clicked my slides. I get too excited. So the opening of the Housing Choice Voucher waiting list is actually a really big deal. Nationally, metropolitan area waiting lists are closed. And when they do open, not everyone gets on the Housing Choice Voucher waiting list. And if they are lucky enough to get on the list, they can wait several years to get a voucher. The Housing Choice Voucher program is not an entitlement program. So not everyone that needs a voucher, unfortunately, gets one. You heard our budget issues, right? There's not enough money. We get a certain amount of vouchers from the federal government to administer. So housing authorities operate their program through a waiting list. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, requires housing agencies to adopt policies for establishing and maintaining a waiting list for the Housing Choice Voucher Rent Assistance Program. We, as a housing authority, have the discretion for determining the time frame for opening the waiting list. So how many days are we going to be open? The number of applications that we're going to accept, and through what process. Maybe we're going to do it via a lottery. How we will accept applications. Will we have people mail them in? Will they come into our office? Will they do it online? And we'll talk about the journey that the Metro HRA has been on over the years. And what kind of preferences that we would provide. So housing authorities have an opportunity to create residency preferences. So maybe they're going to accept applications for folks that live, work, or go to school in their jurisdiction, for veterans, for working families, for homeless families. So housing authorities are faced with making these critical decisions about their waiting list. So you've heard this previously, but there are 10 of us. There's 10 housing authorities in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. They all range in size of programs. So Bloomington and Washington County have pretty small allocations of vouchers, to us being the largest voucher provider in the Twin Cities area. We have our own rules, so every housing authority has their own sets of rules, and they manage their own waiting list. They establish their own preferences, and families have the option throughout the Twin Cities to apply to all of those housing authorities based on when they open and what those regional or local preferences are. You can imagine, if you're searching for affordable housing, that this can be very stressful and it can be very complicated. So, as I said before, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is not an entitlement program. We work off a waiting list. And so I thought it might be nice for me to step back and tell you about how those needs fit in. So each month, Terry mentioned about 60 Housing Choice Vouchers turn over every single month through attrition. And so these slots are filled through pulling names off of our waiting list. So we can do it through waiting list admissions, and that's our goal, right, is to serve folks off of our waiting list. But we also have the opportunity every month to absorb vouchers from other agencies. So there's a process of portability. So there's 10 housing authorities in the Twin Cities, as well as how many housing authorities nationally. And we receive ports in, folks into our jurisdiction, and we set up a billing arrangement. So we have the opportunity to also kind of gap our utilization needs for funding through this absorption. It's, as I said, it's a quick fix to fill our slots quickly and to reduce the administrative burden that goes through that. But our goal is always to be refilling through our waiting list. And our goal is always to have about a 2 to 3 year waiting list wait. That, I'm going to caveat, can be dependent upon funding and turnover. So if we see either a higher or lower turnover rate, or If you all remember the Budget Control Act a few years ago that came into play and sequestration happened, that really halted the amount of funding that we received, which stopped vouchers nationally. Actually, we lost 70,000 vouchers nationally during sequestration. So now I wanted to take you on a little journey of where we've been through the years. So I call it Once Upon a Time. Once upon a time, the HRA opened its housing choice voucher waiting list in 2009, and they opened it for a period of 4 days. And they set up a phone bank. So imagine having all of the HRA coordinators on the phone answering it, saying, would you like an application, and taking down the critical information. And then we mailed out the applications. 16,102 requests came in. Guess what happened to our phone system? We crashed it. We totally crashed the phone system. But we mailed out those applications for completion, and then through the ones that we received, we did a lottery, and we placed 5,000 families on the waiting list at that time. Our postage was about $7,000 to do that. We hired 3 temporary employees to enter, so we had to take the information off of a physical application, enter it into our housing software system, and that took 4 months for 3 employees to do for 5,000 applications. Not the most efficient use of time, but those were the resources that we had, and that's what we did. So 6 years later, in 2015, we had reached the bottom of our waiting list. We needed to replenish, and we had an opportunity to change the way we were delivering our services. And we opened up through an online system, and it was a success. We were open for a 4-day period, and during that 4-day period, anyone that wanted to apply for the Housing Choice Voucher could do so electronically, 24 hours access to that system. We did robust public engagement prior to the opening, and we received, you may have read about it in the paper, 36,000 applications in a 4-day period. We placed 2,000 of those 36,000 applications on the waiting list. We did a waiting list preference for placement, and we put 95% of those that applied on the list, and they either lived, worked, or attended school in the 7-county metro area, and 5% of our waiting list placements were from out of state. And we did that to balance choice and opportunity, knowing that folks that wanted the opportunity to live here could have that opportunity. So we did a 5% placement from out of state. And now we are at the point in time where we need to replenish our waiting list. The year is 2019. We are slated to open June 12th through the 18th. You might have heard a little hesitation in my voice. We are slated. We're hoping that all the cards align with our software vendor, and I'm going to talk a little bit of why that might get a little shaky here in a minute. But we have not done a public notice. I'm sharing this with you personally, and well, anybody that's watching this live, that we're slated to open. The cool thing is that we are doing a joint opening with Minneapolis Public Housing Authority and the St. Paul Public Housing Authority. It is the big 3 opening at the very same time. So consider the amount of opportunity that this provides for our families. It's very exciting. We will be doing using the same software system. So all 3 organizations will be using the same software vendor. They will have 24-hour access. They can do it through a smartphone, tablets, computers, and we will do, the Metro HRA will do a lottery of 2,000 families again. Again, the 95% of the 7-county metro area will be placed that either live, work, or go to school here, and then 5% from out of state. As always, the question comes up, what do you do for folks that maybe need assistance? So anybody that needs a reasonable accommodation, a person with disabilities, they contact our office and we will work through that process with them. We were very successful with having desk side assistance the last time we were open. You may notice when you walk into the council building, there's those interview cubes. There's a whole bay of interview cubes. We reserve that space, and we have staff assigned during that period of time that we're open. Folks can come in and we will give desk side assistance. Sometimes folks are nervous about doing an online application, and so we're there to do that with them. We walked people through it over the phone, so we will have a phone bank set up so that folks can call in and we can do it via over the phone and help them work through the details of the application as well. So about this partnership and collaboration, we're excited about it. The fact that I think that this is, as Terry was talking about, a way to show innovation. As far as we know, that we may be the first nationally to do something like this, where the three big agencies open up at the same time. I think it shows partnership, innovation, and at the same time, we're offering the opportunity for families to apply for the three largest opportunities in the state. We hope that this will reduce stress. So we talked about the fact that families are waiting list shopping, right? They're waiting to see what organizations are going to be open, and the fact that in one day they can apply for St. Paul, they can apply for Minneapolis, and they can apply for our organization. I think shows that it's, doing it is in the best interest of our families. So we have a robust outreach plan. So we've been working with the communications staff at MPHA in St. Paul. We will be our plan is to provide a 30-day notice of the openings. And we're doing that because we want to make sure, because it's the big three and it's the one opportunity, that everybody knows about it. So we'll be doing press releases. I'll be doing presentations in the community. So the library system, one of the things folks don't realize is that librarians need to be subject matter experts, and folks go to them when the waiting list is open to use their services, and then they end up becoming desk side assistants themselves. And so last time we opened, we did a training with the library staff that seemed to be very successful. So we anticipate doing that again. Outreach to schools. Making sure that the school social workers know that they can push out the information about the waiting list. Social service agencies, our county partners, the continuum of care. One email from a continuum of care, and that's hitting a lot of our social service organizations, advocacy groups, as well as the press. And so we'll be working through all the different groups that we need to make sure, again, that people know about this opportunity. So next steps, again, is we'll do a public notice. And that public notice is will be from all three organizations. So we're doing this as a joint effort. So it'll have Met Council, Minneapolis, and St. Paul's letterhead on it. So that public notice will come out. There'll be press releases. Again, we'll do our outreach efforts. Each agency is going to manage their own opening. So families will have the opportunity to apply for each organization, and then each agency will do their own lottery. So after the waiting list closes, a lottery happens, and then folks from our organization, we will be notifying them of their placement. The nice thing is because this is online, they can go into that waitlist check system, the online system, and they can check themselves, and it will tell them whether they're active or inactive. Active means you made it. Inactive means you didn't make the lottery. And then applicants ongoing will have access. If they've made the lottery and they're on the list, they will have access to the system 24 hours a day. So you can imagine, if you move during that period of time you're shopping or you're waiting for a voucher, the ability to go online and make an address change, and you can make an address change and it hits all of the organizations at the same time. So they can know if they're on the Minneapolis waiting list and ours, that they've updated the information, or a family composition change that they need to do. So they would have all of that access. So with that, I would entertain any questions that you might all have.
Thank you, Ms. Keough. I have in queue Councilmembers Chambliss, Atlas, Ingebrigtsen, and Lindstrom. Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you, Mr. Lilligren and Jennifer. The social media outreach and the press releases, um, does that include public service announcements on the radio?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, Council member, yes, we are planning to do PSAs. I know Minneapolis has a good partnership with KFAI and some other radio stations, so we'll be doing some PSAs with them. Um, and and I am open to any suggestions that you all have as well of things that you want to make sure. I've got my contact information in the presentation. So if there are, any type of media that you think that we should be hitting, let me know. And would be happy to work with our communications department.
Thank you. Yes, I probably would want to know that. And also, if I may, it would be helpful to find out what the social media messaging looks like. I know that for a lot of folks, you've got like 5 seconds to get the information. And a lot of times, what I see is too much detail. So just, getting feedback from different people on what's the best way to get the information out to the most people. And I know that's what you want to do. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Couple quick questions. On one of the slides, I just wasn't clear when it said outstate. Is that out of the state or greater Minnesota?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Council member, both. So,
Okay.
yep. So
Thank you.
it's a national program.
Got it. And then, real quick, are there other languages that will be supported in messaging and or supports for people?
Yes.
Ms. Keough.
Mr. Chair, Council member, and I failed to put that on there, and that's really, really important. Yes, so we will have the notice interpreted in our top 4 languages. So that public notice that goes out will be out in the top 4 languages. And then the application itself, while it is not perfect, and I will fully admit Google Translate is not perfect, but our software vendor does have Google Translate, and it's in, I think, over 60 languages that it's available.
And last question is, of the 34 who do not get chosen, do you have an idea of how many of them would have been eligible? Like, I'm assuming some of them aren't chosen because, well, or you may lose some because they fill out the application, but they're not actually eligible. So I'm just curious, what's the percentage of people who are eligible and are not gonna get placed?
Ms. Keough.
Mr. Chair, Council member, so the lottery is done randomly.
Right.
So all 36,000 people, and it's selected by 2,000. I don't know, and I'm going to look to Terry for this. I don't know that we've ever looked at that 34,000. I don't know that we've ever looked at whether or not they would have been eligible.
Ms. Smith.
Mr. Chair, if I may, Council member, the majority of people that I don't know an exact percentage, but we turn very few people away that come up on the waiting list that are over income. So the reality is we publish the income limits and most people are eligible. So it's a good chance that near all the 34,000 are eligible.
Thank you.
Ugh.
Yeah. It's a lot of people. Anything else, Councilmember?
Sorry. No, that's it.
Thank you. Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you. One, I'm a big fan of the Suburban Ramsey Family Collaborative, and so if you could make sure that they are on the list to get all of this information. 2, congratulations on having this joint open period. I'm sure that took a fair amount of collaboration itself, and having the similar software program. I think that makes a lot of sense. And then my third comment is, I bet 90% of our local governments in our area have some sort of newsletter that goes out to their residents on a regular basis, weekly basis, or whatever. And I'd suggest that's a really good tool to get the word out about the waiting period.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have in queue council members Lee, Wolf, and Atlas Ingebrigtsen. Councilmember Lee.
Thank you. The 2 to 3 year waiting period, how do we compare with other regional HRAs on that?
Ms. Keo.
Mr. Chair, Council Member, I would say for the most part, so when we opened in 2015, we did the 2000 and we're a little bit over that, right? And I think it depends on funding a lot. We know that we don't want to be at the 6 year mark, and I think nationally, housing authorities are getting, for lack of better words, smarter about how many folks they actually put into a lottery so that families are not waiting the dreaded. I mean, there's stories about families waiting 10 years for a voucher. So I think now that housing authorities have the ability to do openings online, it makes it much easier. The amount of we were talking about the administrative staff time and burden, so that when you did, you put 5,000 on the list because of the amount of work that it was. But now that we can do it online, it's a lot easier for a housing authority to open more often. And so I think 2 to 3 years is a pretty fair in comparison to our peers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's one application, which is fantastic, yay. Do they check a box on, do they want to be in 1, 2, or all 3 of the groups, or could they end up in one that they didn't necessarily want?
So, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Wolf, it's not quite yay.
Okay.
So where we're at with our software developer is that it's not one application. I know, which is maybe by next time. So they will have to go to 3 separate applications, but they can do it pretty much simultaneously where it will bring up the next URL. This is what we're hoping is that they'll hit submit. They'll get a receipt that says you've applied for the Metro HRA. Minneapolis Public Housing Section 8 waiting list is open. Click here, and they'll do that. So there is some burden to it. It's not a complete yay, but I'm hoping we will get there. I think because no one has done this before, we're testing the waters with our developer, and given the timing we need to open because we need families on our list, that we're conceding to this for now, but my hope is the next time we open, we'll have a better opportunity to have one button.
Okay.
Thank you. That was my question, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
All right, I have a more eloquent response to that number that's just overwhelming to hear. And this is just such a critical issue for our economy and our state going forward. I'm wondering, how are we connecting with the related philanthropic efforts and maybe this is a not just related to the waiting list, but related to the overall need and also our structural gap. What are those ways that we're connecting to private philanthropic nonprofit organizations who are also mobilizing around this to leverage each other?
Ms. Smith, did you want to respond? Ms. Keo?
I would like to defer to Ms. Smith. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Smith.
Mr. Chair and Council Member, I don't think I have a good answer for you. And part of it is there's not enough money and there's not enough affordable housing to go around. I mean, the council does its part to be involved in regional conversations, and, the Mayor's Housing Task Force and the Fair Housing Implementation Council and regional working groups to try and solve the problem that we face with the shortage of affordable housing. And philanthropic partners are at many of these tables. And I think philanthropic partners are ambitious when it comes to funding, one-time initiatives or supporting certain initiatives. It's been my experience that they're not interested in doing ongoing operating support. But I mean, I agree with you. There's a need for more voucher funding, and that's not unique to Metro HRA or Minnesota. It's all over the place. So
can we take in resources to support additional vouchers from non-federal sources, or is there some, rules about cohabitation or?
Councilmember Lilligren, the federal rules allow us to use any source of funds we want, any local funds to for housing assistance payments.
Thank you.
Councilmember? Further discussion? Further discussion? Seeing none, thanks for your work on this, Ms. Keogh, and thanks for the report.
Thank you.
It is exciting. And finally, on to our final information item today, the Competitive Equity Grant Program update. We have Ms. Starling and Mr. Mullen to present. Welcome.
Thank you. Good late afternoon, council members, chair. We recognize that we're the last people on the agenda, and we will do our best to move through our presentation. We are talking today about the Regional Park System Competitive Equity Grant Program pilot. Sort of a mouthful. This is a program that we've been working very diligently on over the past year. Dan Markell and Amanda Lovely in the back have been particularly providing leadership for the development and conversation of this program. This is an information item, obviously, today. We welcome your questions as we move through today's presentation and our proposal. So there's really two parts to our presentation today. The first is we wanted to give you a little history of how we got to where we are today. And then secondly, at perhaps a high level, we will walk through the 5 scenarios for your consideration. When I say at a high level, we can come back to your next meeting and talk to you additionally if that works for you folks. So the Equity Grant Program, the Parks Equity Grant Program goals. Our goals have been constructed over a long history of work in this area that dates back to actually 2014 in some parks research. Broadly speaking, this competitive equity grant program is different than the other parks grant programs. The other programs are really formula driven. So the legislature, our parks policy plan sets a formula, and that really determines how the money's allocated. This is competitive. Thirdly, this is meant to really spark innovation, increase our capacity to do equity work in parks. We really want to build the capacity of our region to do equity work. This includes the council, our regional park implementing agencies, our partners, and others. We have $300,000 in capital bonds budgeted for 2019 for this program. Here's a little timeline of the history of the program, which dates back to, as I said, in 2014 when we did some qualitative research with focus groups, particularly with people from diverse ethnicities and races. We started in 2014 with that. In 2015, we came up with our regional parks policy plan that laid out a whole host of new strategies. One of them was the competitive equity grant program. In 2016, we did some engagement when we developed the equity toolkit, but we also were working on ideas for this equity grant program. 2017, we did additional focus groups. In 2018, we re-upped the Regional Parks Policy Plan with a commitment to get this program in the field in 2019. And that's what we're going to do. Here's a little bit more detailed timeline around the different stages of the program. We're really in the first column of this slide right now in program development. We've done some creative exercises with a host of groups that Libby will talk about in just a second. We've done some prioritization exercises. Where we are today and where we really need to turn the corner on is the development of this fund distribution program. The fund distribution program really gives the shape of what this is. And that's what we'll bring back to you. We're hoping in June. Libby.
Thank you, Raman. So, Mr. Chair, members, my name is Libby Starling. I am the Deputy Director of the Community Development Division, and I get to give you a bit more of our process and then get into a conversation about scenarios. I will go quickly through some of the process, so stop me as you have particular questions on things that I am skipping over. So in terms of a process, we started with a tool called Question Burst, where we asked different groups, starting with council staff, implementing agency staff, members of the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, and members of the council's Equity Advisory Committee, simply with the parameters that Emmett has laid out for you, what questions do you have about a program? So as a brainstorming tool, just to lay out what's on people's minds, what are the anxieties, what are the thinking, what are the directions and themes. So with that, we heard a large array of question burst responses on this, ranging from will additional money lead implementing agencies to act in different ways? How will a program focused on capital lead to more equitable outcomes? How do we get the program in the field in 2019? What definition of equity are we using? So very much of a vast range of responses to the question burst that we then categorize into 10 key themes, ranging from community engagement to questions about evaluation and accountability, questions about the timeline, moving fast, moving slow, thinking about how different approaches might really focus on equity rather specifically or broadly. So a range of themes really came out of the question burst. And then there's a series of additional issues that came out repeatedly in all of the various audiences where we did the question burst that I do want to highlight specifically. One common theme was $300,000 in funds that can only be used for capital expenses is too small. So that was a repeated theme and an interest in either more money or the next piece, money that can be used for programmatic purposes. So staff for other initiatives or non-capital pieces. So just on that, the council has previously budgeted $300,000 for a capital program. So that is what we're trying to set up as the pilot program for 2019. And going back to the discussion that Lisa led you in about an hour and a half ago, thinking about opportunities to either change the amount of funding or change what types of purposes equity grant funds could be used for, that's a conversation for future budget conversations that you can have. So in this, we are moving forward with a pilot program, $300,000 in capital, recognizing that we heard a lot of concerns about this. Another piece that very much came out as a theme throughout the question burst process was an interest in representation in all of the stages of this work. And so thinking about how we have a range of voices in program creation, particularly project selection, and ultimately in evaluation of a program. So this is another theme that we are keeping track of and holding on as we move forward with the development of the fund distribution plan and moving forward with setting up a review committee that will ultimately do evaluation in the or project selection in the shorter term, pilot program evaluation in the longer term. So these are some issues that we're setting aside and keeping track of in other ways. We took the 10 themes that came out of the question burst and asked the same groups to prioritize them, forcing our groups to say, you only get this many high rankings, you only get this many low values, to get a sense of what really the priorities were in among different groups, among the themes that came out in the question burst. And in this is the entire graph of this. The key themes that really came out as being priorities across the groupings were community engagement, community partnerships, the importance of evaluation accountability, the grant review process I mentioned, and then really trying to lean in on this issue of is equity broad, is equity specific, and what are the best ways that equity grants to our implementing agencies can really get to the overall programmatic goal of strengthening equitable usage.
So this is the process to date. And now we're in what we're thinking of as step 3, where what we are laying out for discussion, and the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission talked about this last week. We are, believe, going to the Equity Advisory Committee later this month. We'll be talking to our implementing agency partners later this month. But this is where we have taken the various parameters that were laid out to us, setting up the program in 2019, $300,000 for capital projects, competitive program awarded to implementing agencies, and the input we received through the process of the importance of community engagement, thinking about equity articulately, having a range of award sizes, and programs that are scalable and accountable when we get to that evaluation stage. So with that, we have laid out 5 possible scenarios that what we're looking for, perhaps not today, perhaps in your meeting in 2 weeks, is to get a sense of what intrigues you, what interests you, where you have concerns. This is not intended as a multiple choice pick 1 out of 5. This is intended as scenarios to spark your imagination and to hear what interests you in such a way that we can come back in June with a program design that is responsive to the feedback that we are obtaining this month. So that is the intent. It is not multiple choice. Interested in feedback in all of them. So the 5 that we've laid out would be, and we can talk about these more, 1 that we're calling regional equity collaboration, 1 that we're calling community engagement for capital projects, 1 that would be community-led projects, 1 that would be a focus on public art, and finally an open call. So the discussion that we would like to have with you is looking at all of these 5 scenarios. How do they reflect your policy values? How would they increase the equitable usage of the regional park system? What strengths do they have? What challenges do they have? And how are the themes that we've heard in the feedback addressed in the scenario? So that's the conversation that we're looking for. So now, with your permission, I'll go through each of these 5 scenarios. Starting with what we're calling a regional equity topic or regional equity collaboration. The vision of this is that an inclusive committee, yet to be identified, would select 1 equity topic for a grant cycle. All 10 of the implementing agencies would work together with council support to understand the topic, understand the opportunities, receive common technical assistance, common capacity building. And then after some collaborative work, there would be an opportunity for applications, a competitive process to address this particular topic. So topic might be racial equity, it might be accessibility, it might be a focus on regional trail usage. There could be any range, but this idea is that there would be 1 topic per grant cycle. So this leans heavily on community partnership, this leans heavily on capacity building because all 10 agencies would benefit on this. In the interest of time, I'll move through all of these. The next one is community engagement for capital projects. And this would be an opportunity for agencies to apply for additional funding to support in-depth engagement with the community to shape capital projects that are already in queue for funding. So looking at projects that have already been selected or projects that are already in the queue. And the grant funds would support additional refinement. This is one that there's some delicate dance with in terms of community engagement on its own, does not meet the parameters for capital. But looking at particularly thinking about our major transit projects, community engagement is absolutely considered capital funding for this. So if there is interest, we will make sure that we are consistent with our expectations of when community engagement can be considered a capital use. But this is responsive to the key theme that we heard in the value of community engagement throughout this process. The third one that we're looking at is public art, because that we know arts and culture can often be used as a way of welcoming underrepresented communities into regional parks and trails and creating a way of
people seeing themselves reflected in our regional park system. And we also know that artists have the ability to translate and transcend and hold difficult equity conversations and bring new ideas and perspectives into the conversation. So the image is of a project of putting Dakota language in the sidewalk around Bade-Makaska. So this is another particular theme, public art for 2019. Scenario 4 would be community-led projects. And so the vision of this is that implementing agencies would be asked to partner with a community-led effort in a regional park or trail to produce a capital project. And in this case, it would be a conversation of community organizations leading the discussion, shaping the process, and ultimately sharing in decision making. So this is a scenario that would lean heavily in community partnerships, lean heavily in community engagement. But we have timeline highlighted because this is one which could take a longer timeline in order to set up because of the importance of establishing the partnership at the beginning. And then the final scenario to put out is the open call. And in this case, regional parks implementing agencies would be welcome to propose a range of equity-focused projects. So no specific focus, no specific parameters, but more we're interested in what the innovative ideas are to strengthen equitable usage. And this would mean that the grant review process would become very important in trying to prioritize which projects are ultimately selected because there would be a lot of burden on that to make the ultimate decisions. So these are the 5 scenarios that we are proposing for conversation to get a sense of which ones reflect your policy values, how they would increase use, what strengths, challenges, opportunities you see across each of these, and thinking about the themes. So what we'd like to do is either today or at your next meeting to really hear from you what you see as the opportunities and challenges across these 5 scenarios so that then by June, we are able to come back to our Parks and Open Space Commission and then to the Community Development Committee with a proposal that maximizes the program parameters against the feedback that we are receiving.
Thank you, Ms. Darlene. Councilmember Lee.
Thank you. This is really exciting, and I really appreciate and commend all your work. This reminds me of my time on the St. Paul Capital Improvement Budget. It's one of the bodies I had to give up to serve here, and a situation came up where a community group wanted to ask us for money to work on, improve, and kind of give a rebirth of life to an old theater. And it didn't meet the legal definitions of what the things that we could fund, but there was enough community activism and pressure that we symbolically kind of kept pushing it through the body, and that gave the mayor a really strong message, and ultimately the city was able to help find other sources to help the community. And the point of the story is that these things are important. Art and storytelling is really important to community, especially in all the work that we do. A lot of the work, it really impacts community and their displacement. And I think if we can affect creative storytelling and art and placemaking, I think of, as a amateur historian, I'm a military and diplomatic history buff, and I think of, while I was hearing your whole presentation, I was thinking of West Side history tours on the west side of St. Paul. There's one in the fall where they take you on ghost tours, and they take you around and tell you real life ghost stories of horrible events that happen on the west side, and also there's a gangster tour where the tour guides take you around St. Paul and tell you about the 1930s Prohibition era gangsters and the lives and the events that happened throughout the city. But we're talking about the 1930s in St. Paul. That's a really white space. It's a really white history. What if we could do that with the Karen community and the Hmong community, the Somali community, and do similar cultural specific tours and stories and uplift their experiences as new immigrants to these places and parks. And I think this is a really great idea. So thank you.
Thank you. I'll just go through the queue, or did you want to respond? I'll just go.
Mr.
Okay,
Chair,
well,
go ahead.
thank you. So Councilmember Lindstrom, then Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Mr.
Councilmember
Chair. Clearly, we're not the first people to think about this as an issue. This must be an issue around the nation. And I'm wondering about best practices. If you could share with us some best practices over the next week or two to know what works. I mean, ultimately, our goal is to have more people visit the parks in an equitable fashion. So does public art, does that work in drawing people in? Has there been research on that? Does additional community engagement work, or have people tried that and haven't really seen anything really change? So what I'd like to see is some best practices around these issues.
Thank you. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
So just a couple pieces, maybe to shed a little light. We do have our Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, who is reviewing and also providing feedback on this as well. Hopefully make sure we're clear about amplifying their feedback when it comes before the committee here, so that this committee knows what our commission members have shared. This is capital specific, so programming is not, Councilmember Lee, programming is not an option for this funding. And I think it would just be really helpful for those who aren't involved in these kinds of projects to understand. And I have a question about, how does increasing winter recreational activities, how is that a capital? I could see how it could be a capital program versus a programming, but I could not see it being a successful thing without a programming component to it. So I think it would be very helpful for this group to really put some parameters on what's capital, what's program, what would qualify into that context. And as a couple of things, and I think it makes sense for us to hear this over the next couple of weeks, is what does equity broad and equity specific mean? That would be helpful to know. And for for you all today, for our committee's benefit, just a reminder, I shared this at one of our meetings, but the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission did have quite a bit of feedback about this. One, being very grateful that the money was outlined and used, but two, recognizing it doesn't follow best practice in the context that best practice in our own research really shows that investing in programming is really, and communications are really where best practices lie at addressing issues of inequity or access. While there's certainly capital expenses around access that are important, especially when you talk about some of these types of innovations, but also physical ability access as well. They also wanted to encourage us to not use a formula distribution method. And I think also in the line of that spirit, I would say making sure that it's not just implementing agencies. They were really concerned that people see quickly innovative and different things. And that if it's just more money going out at the and I guess one of the things that one of the members communicated was just a lack of innovation, and we need to really focus on that need to really do things differently, and this is an opportunity to shine, and so we should be doing that. So I just wanted to reflect some of their feedback from our commission.
Thank you, Councilmember. Thank you. Councilmember Vento.
I'm going to piggyback a little bit off of what Council Member Lindstrom talked about. In addition to the past or the best practices, I'm also curious as to, with the regional parks and park preserves, how many of them have friends organizations and how many of them have also approached this concept, whether it be with capital or with programming, and what lessons did they learn that might help us? I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Mhm.
if it doesn't, let me know because it kind of does in my head.
Thank you. Councilmember Chambliss and Councilmember Wolf.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about the decision criteria and how we updated our 2018 policy parks plan. With respect to the barriers to participation and community engagement that occurred in 2014, I think we should, I'd like to look at that before I make a decision, is how did we come to the priorities and how far away are we from where we started in 2014 in terms of barriers and the interests of the community? I think that's critically important. And I also think it's very important to look at, um, the weights of our decision in terms of how we decide what's important for equity and what's important in terms of best practices for equity and balancing innovation with best practices for equity. And as you said, Linnea, looking at the definitions, the micro definition. I don't know if that's not your exact wording, but it's very important to carry that over into our work and making sure that um, if it's innovative, that's great. But is that really going to get us back to what the needs are from 2014 in terms of barriers to participation?
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have more research we need to do on barriers to participation. And one of the things that MPOSC has been talking about, or at least the implementing agencies have been talking about, is doing a survey of people who aren't at the parks. We do a lot of surveys of people who are, but having a random survey of people who aren't at the parks, as opposed to just the focus group sort of thing that we had in 2014, will give us better data, but we don't have that yet. As far as these 5 options here, I have a lot of concerns about the public art thing in terms of we've had a few stumbles in the past. The gallows that they tried to put in at the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden being
That wasn't us.
no,
Don't own that.
no,
That
I'm
wasn't
not
us.
saying, but I'm saying getting into the world of funding public art, seeing some big mistakes. One that we were able to successfully stop in St. Paul was with the Chinese garden that they're doing there. Chinese people have a different name for the Hmong people. And out of respect to Councilmember Lee, I'm not going to say that word out loud because I don't know how offensive it might be to him. But I know from talking to other Hmong people, the word is considered very derogatory. And they were going to put it on the structure in the park because for the Chinese people, that's just the word that you call Hmong people. And it came out that was in the plans, and so there was discussions, and it came to MPOSC about letting the Hmong people choose their own word that they want to be called, and so that language has changed. But art is very subjective, and you might have one group saying what they think should be in the park to be welcoming, and it might be unwelcoming to somebody else. So there's a lot of potential pitfalls there where I guess I'd like to try something that has more likelihood of being accessible to everybody, sort of a thing.
Thank you. I have in queue Councilmembers Atlas Ingerbritsen and Lindstrom. Councilmember Atlas Ingerbritsen.
Just real quick, another thing that we talked about at the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission is that we end in our, and it's not just in that conversation, but in our region, we navel gaze equity issues to death. I think some of the best research done in the field, honestly, was done by this body, and we should feel good about it, and we should use it, and we should be familiar with it before we do more, and that we need to take action. And it was very clear from the commissioners that they were very, a number of them, not all, but many of them were very anxious to actually get something done. that we've created toolkits and talked about it and evaluated it and researched it up one side and down the other. Let's get something done and quickly. So I just want to share that. And then also an invitation for anyone who'd like to know more about this work to connect with their commissioner for the district that we're in. I think we should lean on our structure to do our work, and they are meeting on this stuff, talking about it, reviewing it, and providing feedback. So I encourage you to connect with your person, and I welcome any conversations with myself as well. So I just want to make that invitation to committee members.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I recall when I applied for this position, reading an article in the Star Tribune, and I read it 3 months ago, but I'm not positive when it came out. You probably know what article I'm talking about. It was less than complimentary about the efforts so far. I think it was saying that the efforts so far just haven't moved the needle on equity in the parks. I'm wondering if you could comment on, is your perception that we're making great strides or got a lot of work to do, both? And do you know what article I'm talking about from the Star Tribune? I think it was from the Star Tribune.
Mr. Mullen.
Council members, I'm not sure I know the article. Your broader question though about are we making progress? Yes. Do we have a lot to do? Most definitely. There's a lot left undone. I do think that we have a collaboration with the regional park implementing agencies, and how they understand equity really varies as you move across the region. But and their capacity to do equity work, I think, also varies. But I do think that each of the agencies is committed to moving forward. They just are in different places. So we have work to do. There's no doubt. I don't want to. I want to underscore Councilmember AI's earlier point that there's a lot of urgency at the Parks and Open Space Commission. They want to see the competitive equity grant program get out in the field 2019, and so this is a pilot effort. We know with this smaller amount of money, with capital money, that this is not going to crack the nut the first time, but we know that this is something that we will need to do, we will need to evaluate, and we will need to make better.
Thank you. Thanks. And just to put in my 2 cents in, I guess at the end here is that, I agree with all the comments that came before, the risks of public art and the importance of programming for sure. And for me, out of the 5 sort of options we were talking about, the community-led project kind of mitigates some of those risks if you have the community actually engaged, and it's sort of the most like programming. But the point is to get different people using our parks and really engaging the communities that we're trying to increase the presence of in the parks is important. So what that project might be, I would know the community, up to the community to decide, and I know that that's probably the longest lead time of any of these projects, but I would be wanting to engage the communities. Anything else on this, committee members? It sounds like we're going to see this again on the 20th. And Ms. Starling?
Mr. Chair, just to wrap up, we will come back to you on your agenda in 2 weeks. There are some requests for information that we will respond. On the 20th, what we'd like to do is just revisit, really focus in on these 5 scenarios, just to get ideas about which pieces of it are of interest, which pieces of it are concern. It's okay to like multiple scenarios that we're putting in front of you. So we're not looking, it's not multiple choice, it's not pick one, but we want to re-engage in that conversation in such a way that we can move forward with a single proposal in June to keep this moving forward.
Thank you. Committee members, anything? Thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we have dispensed with our agenda, I will let you know, I will not be here on the 20th. We'll be in the hands of our capable Vice Chair, Councilmember Mento. And with that, I'd seek a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
All right, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.